There is a whole collapsed world sitting above your head in Ark Raiders, and almost nobody has stopped long enough to actually piece together what it means, who built it, who lost it, and what the machines circling the ruins are actually after. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. I want to be upfront about something before we dive in. I put this video together because I kept finding myself going down rabbit holes after every session of Ark Raiders, noticing details that didn't quite line up with what the game was telling me on the surface. So I started collecting things: item descriptions, environmental details, audio logs, the specific way certain machines move, the architecture of places that feel like they were built for people, but clearly haven't seen people in a very long time. Over weeks, this collection turned into something that felt like it had a shape to it. This video is my attempt to trace that shape. I want to be clear that what you're going to hear is interpretation, not confirmed canon. There are things in this video I am genuinely uncertain about, and I will tell you when I am. There are also places where the lore strongly points in a specific direction, and I will tell you that too. One choice I made deliberately was to lead with the world before the Ark arrived rather than starting with the machines themselves. I made that call because I think you understand the machines better if you first understand what they replaced. So that is where we begin. Chapter 1. The World That Ended. To understand Ark Raiders as a setting, you have to start with what was there before the Ark came. And what was there before was, by all indications, a version of Earth that had already pushed itself very close to the edge. The environmental storytelling scattered across the surface zones suggests a world in the middle of serious industrial and social strain. The infrastructure you move through as a raider is not the infrastructure of a healthy civilization. It is the infrastructure of a civilization that had been running on emergency decisions for a long time. The buildings are utilitarian in a way that suggests function over comfort had already become the default mode. These are not ruins of a golden age. They are ruins of a world that was already working very hard just to keep going. The settlements and facilities visible on the surface tell a specific story about how people organized themselves in the decades before the Ark appeared. There is evidence in the architectural layering of these structures that multiple generations of construction happened in rapid succession, each layer more improvised than the last. You can see this in the way certain buildings have been expanded with materials that clearly don't match the original construction. Walls patched with different grades of metal, doorways that were clearly added after the original build, windows that were bricked up or reframed multiple times. This points toward a population that was constantly adapting its built environment under pressure, which suggests the pressure was already there long before the machines arrived. One reading of the pre-invasion period is that humanity was in the middle of a resource crisis that had already begun reshaping how societies functioned. The equipment you find scattered through surface locations supports this. A lot of it is repair-focused. There are tools designed specifically for extending the life of machines and systems rather than replacing them. There are parts stockpiles that suggest scarcity was already a real factor in how people maintained their infrastructure. The culture of making things last, of patching and reusing, seems to have been well established before the Ark ever appeared. In some ways, that culture is part of what allowed people to survive what came next. The food and agriculture equipment visible in certain surface zones paints a picture of a world trying to manage its feeding of a large population with increasingly limited arable land. The scale of what you find suggests industrial farming was not just common, but necessary, and that the systems keeping people fed were already highly centralized, and therefore highly vulnerable. When the Ark began disrupting surface infrastructure, this centralization would have become catastrophic almost immediately. The fragility was already built in. The invasion did not create the vulnerability, it just found it and applied pressure directly to it. there is something worth noting about the energy infrastructure visible in the pre-invasion built environment. The power systems represented in the surviving structures suggest a world in the middle of transitioning between energy paradigms. You find older generation equipment alongside newer, more experimental systems. You find substations that look like they were designed for one type of power source but have been retrofitted to handle another. This transition was not complete when the Ark arrived. There were still large portions of the infrastructure that depended on systems that were, by that point, already becoming obsolete. That incompletion matters for understanding what happened next. The communications infrastructure of the pre-Ark world is also worth paying attention to. The relay towers, the broadcast equipment, the network nodes visible throughout surface zones represent a society that was deeply connected in terms of information flow. But the redundancy built into those systems tells you something about the level of trust that existed in any single part of the network. There are backup systems for backup systems in places. There are hardened communication bunkers that look like they were built under the assumption that significant parts of the main network might go down at any moment. The people who built those redundancies were not being paranoid. They were being realistic about the fragility of what they had built. The military and security infrastructure visible on the surface is another layer of the pre-Ark world that deserves attention. There are fortifications here that predate the invasion. There are weapons systems and defensive structures that were clearly built before the Ark appeared, designed to deal with threats from other humans, rather than from machines descending from orbit. This points toward a world in which significant geopolitical tension existed alongside the resource and infrastructure pressures already described. The pre-Ark world was not at peace. It was managing a complex web of conflicts and competitions, and those conflicts had already produced a sophisticated military-industrial apparatus that would later be both a resource and a limitation in the fight for survival. The civilian architecture of the pre-Ark world offers the most humanizing details. Homes, community spaces, places of commerce and gathering. These are the things that remind you that the ruins you move through were once inhabited by ordinary people, living ordinary lives. The small details in these spaces matter. The size of rooms, the layout of shared areas, the way spaces were divided between public and private. These details suggest a society that, despite its pressures, had maintained some investment in the idea of community. People still gathered, still cooked together, still built spaces meant to be shared. That investment in community, that habit of cooperation, is arguably what the underground civilization is built on. Education and research facilities visible on the surface suggest a civilization that had not given up on knowledge production, even under pressure. The scale of these institutions, the equipment they contain, the organization of their archives, all point toward a society that still believed understanding its situation was a path toward improving it. There was scientific ambition in the pre-Ark world. There was genuine curiosity about the universe. The discovery of the Ark, when it came, arrived into a society that had the conceptual tools to process what it was seeing, even if it lacked the physical tools to do anything about it. Scientists knew what they were looking at. They understood the scale of the threat. They just could not stop it. The period immediately before the Ark's arrival is particularly interesting to reconstruct because the surviving evidence suggests that some people knew something was coming. Not necessarily the full picture, not necessarily the machines specifically, but there are structures and preparations that point toward a community of people who had concluded that serious disruption was imminent and had begun acting on that conclusion. Underground facilities that predate the invasion, supply caches that were clearly assembled in advance. The design of certain bunker systems suggests they were built with long-term habitation in mind, not as temporary shelters, but as permanent alternatives to surface life. Someone was planning for a world where the surface was no longer viable, and they started that planning before the Ark arrived. The relationship between different social strata in the pre-Ark world shaped who survived and how. The underground facilities that became the foundation of the tunnel civilization were not built by or for everyone equally. The distribution of resources that went underground, the selection of knowledge and technology that was preserved, the priorities baked into the survival infrastructure, all of these reflect the priorities of the people who made the decisions. This is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of the pre-Ark world, the fact that the civilization that emerged underground was not a clean slate but a continuation of existing hierarchies and power structures in a new physical environment. The transportation networks of the pre-Ark world left their mark on the surface in ways that still shape how raiders move through the environment. Road systems, rail lines, aerial infrastructure, all of these represent significant investments by the pre-Ark civilization in connecting its various parts. The deterioration of these networks is one of the most visible signs of the Ark's impact, but their original extent is also visible, and it is impressive. This was a civilization that had solved, or at least significantly addressed, the logistical problems of moving people and goods across large distances. That capability, in degraded but still partially functional form, is part of what makes surface raiding possible at all. The medical and public health infrastructure of the pre-Ark world points toward a civilization grappling with the biological consequences of its own industrial activity. Certain facilities you encounter suggest that dealing with environmental illness and the long-term health effects of industrial contamination was already a significant undertaking before the Ark arrived. The medications and treatment equipment you find are oriented toward managing chronic conditions rather than curing acute ones. This suggests a population that had been living with the consequences of industrial activity for long enough that those consequences had become normalized, just another thing to manage rather than a crisis to solve. There is a specific class of pre-Ark structure that appears throughout the surface world, and that I find particularly compelling as a piece of environmental storytelling. These are facilities that appear to have been repurposed, sometimes multiple times, across different eras. Buildings that started as one thing became something else, and then became something else again. The layering of different uses within a single structure tells you something about how adaptable this civilization was, and also about how much pressure it was under. When you keep repurposing the same building rather than building a new one, you're telling a story about constraint, about making do, about a society that was running out of options even before the sky started falling. The agricultural and water management infrastructure of the surface zones deserves more attention than it usually gets in discussions of Ark Raiders lore. These systems, the irrigation networks, the reservoir structures, the water treatment facilities, represent an enormous investment of material and engineering effort. Their scale suggests that water scarcity was already a significant concern in the pre-Ark world, and that managing that scarcity required coordinated action at a civilizational level. The failure of these systems after the Ark arrived would have been one of the most immediate and devastating consequences of the invasion for any surface populations that tried to stay. The energy extraction infrastructure, visible in certain surface zones, is among the most visually striking remnants of the pre-Ark world. The scale of these facilities, the size of the machinery involved, the engineering challenges they represent, all speak to a civilization that had committed deeply to extracting energy from the earth itself. The environmental consequences of that extraction are visible in the landscape around these facilities, in soil composition, in the state of the vegetation, in the way water moves through these areas. The pre-Ark world made serious trade-offs to power itself, and the evidence of those trade-offs is written into the landscape that raiders move through today. The cultural artifacts scattered through the surface world offer glimpses of what everyday life felt like in the pre-Ark period. The entertainment, art, and consumer objects you encounter suggest a civilization that was, in some meaningful sense, still functioning as a normal human society, even under the pressures being described. People were still telling stories, still making music, still engaging with beauty and humour and the pleasures of ordinary life. This normalcy, alongside the evidence of strain, is one of the most poignant aspects of what the pre-ark world seems to have been. It was not a dystopia. It was a world of people trying to live their lives in difficult circumstances, and then something arrived that made those circumstances exponentially worse. The financial and administrative infrastructure of the pre-ark world is legible in the kinds of buildings and records you encounter. This was a civilization with complex economic systems, with bureaucratic structures designed to manage large amounts of information and coordinate large numbers of people. The record keeping you find suggests a society deeply invested in tracking things, in maintaining systems of accountability and exchange. How much of this infrastructure made it underground is an interesting question. The answer, based on what you see in the tunnel civilization, seems to be that some of it survived but in modified form. The instinct to track and record and organize clearly persisted, but the specific systems and structures of the pre-ark economy clearly did not. One of the most interesting aspects of the pre-ark world is the evidence of scientific and technological ambition that goes beyond the practical and into the speculative. Research facilities you encounter were clearly working on problems at the frontier of human knowledge. The equipment in some of these places suggests attempts to understand fundamental aspects of physics, biology, and materials science that were well beyond what had been practically applied in everyday life. This gap between the frontier of scientific understanding and the ordinary level of technological application is typical of advanced civilizations. But it is particularly significant in this case because some of that frontier research may have contributed to or been directly related to the events that brought the Ark to Earth. The military research and development infrastructure of the pre-Ark world is a particularly sensitive area of law that the game gestures toward without fully revealing. There are facilities that clearly were not ordinary military bases, places where significant scientific resources were being directed toward weapons-related research. The nature of that research is not entirely clear, but the scale of the investment and the level of security surrounding certain sites points towards something ambitious. Whether any of that research had a direct connection to the Ark's arrival is one of the most intriguing open questions in the lore, and one I will return to in later chapters. The social movements and political changes of the pre-Ark period are partially visible in the physical environment. Graffiti, signage, the repurposing of public spaces, all of these tell stories about populations that were active, opinionated, and in some cases, in serious conflict with the power structures they lived under. The pre-Ark world was not politically stable. There were significant movements pushing for change in how resources were managed, how power was distributed, how the environmental consequences of industrial activity were handled. These movements left their mark on the physical environment, and that mark is still readable in the ruins raiders move through today. The pre-Ark world had its own relationship with automation and artificial intelligence, and understanding that relationship is important for understanding what happened when the Ark arrived. There is evidence of significant automation in the manufacturing and logistics sectors visible in certain surface facilities. Robotic systems, automated production lines, AI-assisted management systems. The pre-Ark world was already navigating the social and economic disruptions caused by the automation of work. The arrival of the Ark introduced a new and infinitely more threatening kind of machine into a society that already had complicated feelings about machines. The generational experience of living in the late pre-Ark world is something you can piece together from the kinds of consumer goods and cultural artifacts found in living spaces throughout the surface zones. Different generations had different relationships to the accumulation of comfort and the expectation of stability. Older items in these spaces suggest more faith in permanence, in the idea that things built would last, that life would continue in predictable ways. Newer items suggest a shorter time horizon, less investment in permanence, more focus on immediate experience. This shift in cultural orientation, this shortening of the expected future, was already happening before the Ark arrived. Something in the pre-Ark culture had already absorbed the lesson that the future was less certain than it had once seemed. The urban planning of the pre-Ark world is visible in the layouts of the settlements and cities whose ruins you move through. These places were designed with a particular vision of how human life should be organized, and that vision reflects the values and assumptions of the era that built them. The balance between density and open space, between public infrastructure and private ownership, between efficiency and livability, all of these trade-offs are embedded in the physical structure of these places. Reading them is reading a kind of unconscious autobiography of the civilization that made them. The relationship between the pre-Ark world and its own history is visible in the museums, memorials, and historical markers you encounter in the surface world. This was a civilization that was aware of its own historical moment, that saw itself as part of a longer story, and tried to preserve knowledge of that story. The things it chose to memorialize, the histories it chose to tell, reflect its priorities, and the fact that those memorials are now just more ruins among ruins is one of the quieter tragedies in the Ark Raiders setting. The history those memorials were trying to preserve has itself become history. The elderly infrastructure of the pre-Ark world, the systems and structures that were already aging when the Ark arrived, tells a story about the maintenance burden that civilization was already carrying. Not everything you see in the ruins was in good shape when the machines came. Some of it was already failing, already patched beyond any reasonable extension of its useful life. The Ark's disruption did not destroy a world in prime condition. It broke a world that was already straining under the weight of deferred maintenance and accumulated debt. That context matters for understanding why things fell apart as quickly as they did. One reading of the pre-Ark period's final years is that the civilization was in the process of something like a managed decline, an attempt to rationalize and scale back certain activities while trying to preserve the core of what made it function. The evidence for this is in the selective abandonment you can trace in certain zones, places where activity clearly concentrated rather than expanding, where resources were pulled back from less critical areas. This is not a civilization confidently expanding. It is one trying to consolidate. Whether that consolidation would have been successful in the absence of the Ark is impossible to say, but the instinct behind it, the pragmatic acceptance that not everything could be maintained, would have served the survivors well. The last generation to grow up fully on the surface before the Ark arrived would have had a specific experience of the world that shaped everything that came after. They would have grown up with the expectation of surface life as normal, with the outdoors as their default relationship to the world, with the sky as just the sky rather than a source of existential threat. That generation carries a memory and a loss that later generations, born underground, simply cannot share. The grief of that difference is one of the quieter emotional currents running through Ark Raiders lore, and it is something worth sitting with. The pre-Ark world's approach to disaster preparation is visible in the infrastructure it left behind, and equally importantly, in the infrastructure it did not leave behind. The gaps are as telling as the things that exist. The places where serious investment in resilience and redundancy was made stand in contrast to the places where no such investment happened. The distribution of that preparation was uneven in ways that reflect the priorities of the people who made the decisions. Some communities were well prepared, others were left to face whatever came with minimal support. That unevenness is part of the legacy the underground civilization inherited. The scientific community's awareness of the Ark's approach, in whatever form that awareness took, is one of the most important threads in the pre-Ark lore that the game has not fully resolved. It is clear from various evidence that some people with scientific or governmental authority had information about what was coming that was not widely shared. The question of what that information was, how it was obtained, and why it was kept from the broader population is one of the central mysteries of the pre-Ark period. The decisions made on the basis of that information, the underground facilities built, the resources allocated, the people selected for survival, all trace back to that moment of knowledge and the choices made with it. The role of private versus public institutions in the pre-Ark world's preparation for and response to the invasion is a theme that runs through a lot of the environmental storytelling. Some of the best prepared underground facilities appear to have been built with private rather than public resources, suggesting that certain actors with access to resources had more advanced information or more proactive response than public institutions. The implications of this for the social structure of the underground civilization are significant. The people who built the best bunkers had the most power in the world that came after, and the circumstances of how they got that power are not always flattering. The relationship between the pre-Ark world's various nations and power blocks is incompletely legible in the physical evidence but clearly relevant to the overall picture. The surface world shows signs of a complex geopolitical landscape that was not unified in its response to any of the pre-invasion stresses. Different regions bear the marks of different political and economic systems, different levels of development, different relationships to the resource pressures being described. The Ark arrived into a fragmented world, not a unified one, and that fragmentation shaped both the immediate experience of the invasion and the longer-term development of the underground civilization. The ecology of the pre-Ark surface world, what it looked like before the machines began their work on it, is visible in traces and remnants scattered throughout the surface zones. The natural world of the pre-Ark period was already significantly shaped by human activity, but it was still a living ecosystem with complexity and resilience. The Ark's impact on that ecosystem is dramatic and ongoing, and understanding what was there before helps you appreciate the scale of what has been lost. Not just human civilization, the living world that human civilization existed within and depended on. The specific geography of the Ark Raiders' surface world, the physical landscape that was there before and that the ruins are built upon, is a kind of silent context for everything else. The terrain shapes movement, concentrates resources, creates barriers and corridors. The pre-Ark world chose its locations for practical reasons related to geography, and those choices are still readable in where things are and how they are oriented. A good raider or a good lore analyst pays attention to geography not just as tactical information, but as historical evidence. One of the most emotionally resonant aspects of the pre-Ark world that the game captures is the sense of ordinary people who had no particular reason to expect catastrophe. The personal effects, the abandoned homes, the half-finished projects, and half-eaten meals of the surface world carry a specific kind of weight. These are not the remains of people who saw it coming. These are the remains of people who were interrupted in the middle of their lives. The abruptness of that interruption is written into everything they left behind, and it is one of the things that keeps the Ark Raiders' surface world from feeling like just a game level, rather than a place where something real was lost. The communications records and broadcasts that can be pieced together from various surface locations tell a story of a civilization that tried to respond to the Ark's arrival in real time, that tried to maintain order and information flow even as things fell apart. The gap between the official messaging of that period and what was actually happening is visible in the contrast between institutional communications and the personal notes and improvised records left by ordinary people. Official channels were trying to manage fear, individual people were trying to survive. The gap between those two activities is one of the defining features of the early invasion period. The medical response to the early invasion period is partially visible in the condition and contents of medical facilities found on the surface. These facilities were clearly overwhelmed. The evidence of triage of difficult decisions made under extreme pressure, of resources stretched far beyond their designed capacity, all paint a picture of a healthcare system that was not built for what it was being asked to handle. The specific nature of the injuries and conditions being treated in the early period is interesting from a law perspective, suggesting that the Ark's initial impact was not just physical destruction, but included environmental and biological effects that were not immediately understood. The educational institutions of the pre-Ark world have a particular poignancy as ruins. Schools and universities are places built on the assumption of a future, on the idea that preparing young people for the world ahead is a worthwhile investment. The abandonment of these places represents a very specific kind of ending, the moment when the assumption of a future became untenable. The materials found in these places, the curricula, the research, the student work, all represent knowledge and potential that was interrupted. Some of that knowledge was preserved and carried underground. Much of it was not. The religious and spiritual institutions of the pre-Ark world left physical evidence that tells its own story about how people processed the experience of radical uncertainty. Places of worship, meditation centers, community gathering spaces organized around shared belief or practice. These spaces saw significant use in the period leading up to and during the early invasion. The evidence suggests both a turn towards spiritual community in the face of catastrophe and also a fracturing of established institutions under the pressure of events that defied easy explanation within traditional frameworks. People sought meaning. The institutions that had previously provided it were not always equal to what was being asked of them. The relationship between the pre-Ark world and its own children, the generation that was young when the invasion began, is one of the most important and least explored aspects of the setting. The decisions made by adults in those early days about what to prioritize, who to save, what to tell children versus what to hide, shaped a generation that would become the foundation of the underground civilization. The people who are now elders in the tunnel world carry memories of that childhood experience, of the surface, of the invasion, of being carried into the earth by adults who are trying to protect them. That experience is formative in ways that ripple through the entire culture of the underground world. The economic collapse of the surface world happened faster than almost any other aspect of the pre-Ark society's dissolution. Economic systems depend on trust, on shared expectations about the future, on the assumption that the rules governing exchange will continue to apply. When the Ark disrupted those assumptions at scale, the economic infrastructure of the surface world became largely meaningless almost overnight. The transition from economic actors to survivors happened faster than most people were psychologically prepared for, and the evidence of that transition, of people moving from ordinary economic activity to desperate improvisation, is visible in the surface world's ruins. The political dissolution of the pre-Ark world's governing institutions followed a more complex trajectory than the economic collapse, but it was equally significant in shaping what came after. Some institutions maintained coherence longer than others. Some leaders performed their roles with genuine commitment, even in the face of the collapse of everything those roles were built to manage. Others did not. The decisions made by political authorities in the early invasion period, both the good decisions and the catastrophically bad ones, are part of the foundation of the underground civilization's relationship with authority and governance. That relationship is complicated, and the pre-Ark period's political failures are part of the reason why. The engineering and construction activity of the very early invasion period, as people scrambled to adapt their surface infrastructure into survival infrastructure, represents a kind of compressed version of human ingenuity under extreme pressure. The improvised modifications to buildings, the emergency excavation projects, the rapid repurposing of industrial equipment for survival applications, all of this happened in a very short time. The quality varies enormously. Some of the improvised engineering of that period is impressive. Some of it is the kind of desperate work that you do when you have no choice and no time, and you just hope it holds long enough to matter. The written and recorded words of the pre-arc world's final surface period are among the most direct windows into what that experience was like for the people living through it. Personal journals, final broadcasts, messages intended for people who may or may not have received them. These documents, where they survive, carry a weight that manufactured law rarely achieves. They are specific. They name names, describe places, record moments. They are the residue of real human experience translated into the vocabulary of a game world, and they're worth taking seriously. One of the most significant things the pre-arc world left behind, beyond physical infrastructure and recorded information, was a set of habits, assumptions, and reflexes that shaped how the underground civilization developed. The people who built the tunnel world were formed by the surface world. They carried its values, its conflicts, its solutions, and its failures with them into the earth. The underground civilization is not a clean break from what came before. It is a continuation, shaped by catastrophe, filtered through survival, but rooted in the same human soil that produced everything the surface world was. That continuity is one of the most important things to understand about the Ark Raiders setting. The final question of this first chapter is really the one that the entire rest of the video will be built on. The world that existed before the Ark arrived was complex, pressured, fragile in specific ways, and inhabited by people who were living their lives in the middle of it all. When the machines came, that world ended. But endings are never clean. The world that ended left behind its buildings, its technology, its records, its habits, and its people. Understanding what those leftovers tell us about the world they came from is the foundation for understanding everything else about Ark Raiders. So that is where we start, and from here we go deeper. Chapter 2. The First Contact. The moment of first contact between humanity and the Ark is one of the most significant and least understood events in the entire lore. What the game provides in fragments and suggestion, rather than direct statement, points toward a first contact experience that was unlike anything the science fiction scenarios that pre-Ark humanity had imagined. There was no greeting, no communication attempt, no moment of mutual recognition between species. What the evidence suggests is something colder and more mechanical than that. The Ark arrived with a purpose it was already executing. Humanity was not a party to a meeting. It was an obstacle in the middle of a process that had started long before it was noticed. The observable characteristics of the Ark's arrival, as best as they can be reconstructed from the surviving evidence, suggest an event that unfolded over a longer period than the dramatic narrative of a single invasion implies. The machines did not simply appear all at once in a moment of sudden catastrophe. The arrival seems to have been gradual enough that the initial phases were ambiguous, subject to competing interpretations, and processed differently by different communities and institutions. By the time the scale of what was happening became clear to the broadest possible population, significant phases of the Ark's work were already underway. That gradual quality of the arrival is one of the things that makes it so difficult to reconstruct a clean timeline. The scientific community's first encounters with evidence of the Ark's approach are partially recoverable from records found in research facilities on the surface. These records suggest that anomalous data was being collected and discussed in certain scientific communities for a period before any visible contact with Ark machines on the surface. The nature of those anomalies, what they were detecting, and what theories were being advanced to explain them is not entirely clear. But the existence of this prior scientific awareness, even if incomplete and uncertain, is important for understanding why certain institutions responded to the arrival as quickly and as specifically as they did. The first physical encounters between human beings and Ark machines, as distinct from the detection of anomalous signals or phenomena associated with the Ark's approach are among the most important and least documented events in the lore. The survival rate of people who had those early encounters was very low, which partly explains why direct testimony is scarce. The records that do exist are fragmentary, often secondhand, sometimes clearly distorted by the trauma of the experience. What they collectively suggest is that the Ark machines were already operational and purposeful from the very beginning. There was no early phase of apparent dormancy or passivity. The machines were doing something from the moment they were first encountered. What they were doing is one of the central mysteries of the first contact period. The behavior of Ark machines in the earliest documented encounters does not match simple, destructive behavior. It matches something more like harvest, collection. The machines were not simply destroying what they found, they were interacting with the environment in ways that suggested a specific operational agenda. What that agenda was, what they were collecting or processing or building, is not fully revealed by the evidence from this period, but the operational quality of their behavior is consistent. They were not attacking, they were working. The human military response to the Ark's arrival is a chapter in the first contact story that was, by all accounts, characterized by complete failure. Not for lack of effort or commitment. The evidence suggests significant military resources were deployed against the Ark machines in the early period, but the results were consistently the same. The machines did not respond to the deployment of human weapons in any way that suggested they recognized a threat to their operations. They continued whatever they were doing. Military forces that engaged them were destroyed or pushed back, but the engagement seemed to be more like obstacle removal than combat. The machines were not fighting, they were clearing. The decision to go underground, the foundational moment of the tunnel civilization, was not a single, unified decision made by a coordinated authority. It was a pattern of choices made by many different groups in many different locations over a period that stretched across the early invasion. Some of these choices were made by institutional actors with significant resources and advanced planning. Others were made by ordinary people with almost nothing, digging whatever shelter they could find or create. The diversity of the underground infrastructure that resulted from this period reflects the diversity of the circumstances that produced it. There is no single tunnel system. There is a complex, irregular, partially connected network of underground spaces built under different conditions by different people for different reasons. The experience of being on the surface during the Ark's arrival and early consolidation is one of the most important sources of cultural memory in the tunnel civilization. The people who lived through it and survived to tell their stories shaped the underground world's understanding of what the Ark is and what it means. But those stories were shaped by survival. The people who made it underground to tell their stories were not a representative sample of everyone who was on the surface. They were the people who survived specific circumstances, made specific choices, had access to specific resources. Their stories are true, but they are not the whole truth. The stories of people who did not make it underground cannot be told. The communication breakdown that occurred during the first contact period was one of the most practically devastating aspects of the early invasion, independent of the physical destruction the Ark machines caused. Human civilization at that point depended heavily on networked communication infrastructure, and the disruption of that infrastructure, whether as a side effect of the Ark's activities or as something more deliberate, had cascading effects on every aspect of the human response. Coordination failed, information did not flow, communities that might have helped each other could not reach each other. The isolation of the early underground period was partly physical and partly informational, and the informational isolation may have been more damaging in the long run. The Ark machine's relationship to human infrastructure during the first contact period is one of the most studied and least resolved questions in the lore. Some structures were destroyed, others were left intact. Some technologies were specifically targeted, others were ignored. The pattern of what the Ark disrupted versus what it did not is not random, but the principle behind the selection is not obvious from the surviving evidence. Several theories have been advanced. One suggests that the Ark was collecting specific material resources and that the pattern of destruction and preservation reflects what was and was not useful to that collection process. Another suggests that the Ark was executing a program designed to maintain a specific level of disruption without complete annihilation. The evidence does not definitively support either of these readings, but both are worth holding in mind. The period immediately following the initial arrival and before the tunnel civilization was fully established is sometimes called the Surface War in informal accounts, but calling it a war is somewhat misleading. A war implies two sides with some rough parity, some ability to contest the conflict. What the evidence suggests is more like a series of rearguard actions and strategic retreats punctuated by catastrophic losses. Human resistance to the Ark in this period was real, and in some cases locally effective, but it did not change the strategic outcome. The machines continued their work. Humans continued going underground. The trajectory of the conflict was determined very early, and it did not change. One of the most haunting aspects of the first contact period is the evidence of attempts to communicate with the Ark machines. These attempts, documented in various surface records, reflect a hope or belief on the part of at least some humans that the machines might be responsive to communication, might be operating under some kind of decision-making framework that could be engaged with. The results of these attempts are not documented with any detail in the surviving records, but the absence of any evidence that communication was established or any modification of machine behavior occurred suggests that if responses were received, they were not recognizable as communication by the humans who made the attempts, or perhaps there were no responses at all. The scientific study of Ark machines during the first contact period, the attempts to understand what they were, how they worked, what they were made of, represents some of the most important early knowledge generation about the Ark that the tunnel civilization built on. This research happened under obviously extreme conditions, with limited time and resources, often in environments that were themselves under threat. The researchers who conducted it were taking serious personal risks to produce knowledge that might or might not be useful to anyone's survival. Many of them did not survive the period they were working in. The knowledge they produced, incomplete and provisional as it was, is part of the foundation of what the tunnel civilization now understands about the Ark. The role of children during the first contact period is something the law touches on only obliquely, but it is significant. Children were the population least capable of surviving without adult protection, and the decisions made about how to prioritize children's survival during the transition underground shaped the demographics of the early tunnel population in ways that still matter. The very young children of the first contact period are now older people in the tunnel civilization, carrying a particular form of the surface world in their earliest memories. Their experience of the transition is different from those who were adults, and different again from those who were born underground with no personal memory of the surface. The role of pre-existing underground infrastructure in the first contact response is an often underappreciated aspect of the survival story. Natural cave systems, existing tunnel networks, subway systems, utility infrastructure, mining complexes, all of these pre-existing underground spaces became improvised refuge for people who could reach them. The quality of these impromptu refuges varied enormously. Some were well suited to extended human habitation, others were dangerous and marginal. The people who ended up in the better spaces had significant survival advantages over those who ended up in the marginal ones, and those advantages compounded over time in ways that contributed to the uneven development of the tunnel civilization. The Ark's behavior during the first contact period included several aspects that seem to have been deliberately calibrated rather than simply the result of machines executing a fixed program. The timing of certain actions, the way the machines responded or failed to respond to specific human activities, the apparent prioritization of certain targets over others, all suggest a level of adaptive behavior that surprised the humans who encountered it. The Ark machines were not dumb. They were not running a simple fixed script. They were responding to their environment in ways that suggested something more like situational awareness than simple programming. What that awareness is and where it comes from are questions that remain central to the Ark Raiders' lore. The experience of the first contact period left a psychological mark on the tunnel civilization that is still visible in its culture and practices. The specific fears, the specific mitigations, the specific beliefs that developed in response to the Ark during the first contact period became embedded in the culture and were passed down. Some of these inherited responses are still functionally relevant. Others may have been superseded by changed circumstances, but persist out of cultural inertia. Understanding which is one of the challenges facing the current generation in the tunnel world, and it is a challenge that raiding activities are directly relevant to, because raiders are among the people best positioned to generate current knowledge about how the Ark actually behaves. The political consequences of the first contact period for the underground communities that formed during it were profound and lasting. The people and institutions that coordinated effective survival responses accumulated influence and authority. Those that failed lost it, sometimes violently. The early politics of the tunnel world were shaped by the crisis of the first contact period in ways that established patterns of authority and legitimacy that are still operative today. Understanding the current political landscape of the tunnel civilization requires understanding where the current power structures came from, and a significant part of the answer to that question lies in the chaos and necessity of the first contact period. The narratives that the tunnel civilization tells about the first contact period are, in some important ways, more revealing about the current state of the civilization than about the actual events of the period. All historical narrative involves selection and interpretation, and the stories the underground communities have chosen to emphasize about the first contact period reflects their current needs and anxieties as much as the objective record. The heroes of those narratives, the choices that are celebrated, the failures that are downplayed or explained away, all of these tell you something about what the tunnel civilization values and fears in the present. The first contact period established the basic parameters of the human-Ark relationship that still obtain in the present of the game. Humanity is underground. The Ark operates on the surface. Raiders move between these two worlds in a structured but always dangerous activity that is the game's central activity. That basic structure was established during the first contact period, and understanding how it was established, why this specific arrangement and not some other, is essential for understanding the world you're playing in. The arrangement is not inevitable. It is the result of specific historical choices and specific historical failures, and those origins matter. The weapons and tactics that proved locally effective against Ark machines during the first contact period are the ancestors of the current raiding toolkit. The people who survived the surface long enough to experiment with what worked against the machines produced knowledge that was carried underground and preserved. Not all of it survived intact. Some of it was distorted by the distance between direct experience and the accounts that reached the tunnel communities. But the core of the raiding knowledge that current players deploy has roots in the desperate experiments of the first contact period, and understanding those roots is part of understanding why the tools work the way they do. The specific geography of the first contact, the places where key events occurred, the locations that saw significant human-Ark engagement or significant human adaptation is partially recoverable from the surface world. Certain locations bear the marks of intense activity during this period in ways that are still readable. These sites are among the most interesting lore locations in the surface world because they carry the most direct evidence of the pivotal period when humanity's fate was being determined in real time. A careful eye for the layering of evidence in these places can recover something of the story of what happened there. The documentation of arc machine behavior during the first contact period, fragmentary and unreliable as it is, has been supplemented over the years of tunnel civilization by the ongoing work of raiders who encounter the machines regularly. The current understanding of arc behavior is a synthesis of first contact era records and accumulated raiding experience. That synthesis is imperfect, full of gaps and contested interpretations, but it represents a genuine, if incomplete, body of knowledge about entities that remain fundamentally mysterious. The first contact period is where the mystery began, and in some ways it is where the deepest questions about the arc's nature were first posed. The religious and spiritual significance of the first contact period in the culture of the tunnel civilization is a thread that runs through many aspects of the underground world. The event that fundamentally restructured human existence, that ended one world and forced the creation of another, carries an almost mythological weight in how the tunnel communities understand their own situation. The arc is not just a physical threat. For many in the underground world, it is a symbol of something larger, something that touches on the deepest questions about humanity's place in a universe that apparently contains things vastly more powerful than human civilization. That symbolic weight shapes how people relate to the practical reality of the arc. The survivors of the first contact period who made it underground carried not just knowledge and physical resources, but trauma. The psychological consequences of witnessing the destruction of the surface world, of losing family members and communities, of experiencing the complete collapse of the civilization you had grown up in, were significant and lasting. Those consequences shaped the social and cultural life of the early tunnel communities in ways that the communities themselves did not always clearly understand. The first generation of underground survivors was, in important ways, a traumatized population trying to build something functional out of collective grief. The communities they built reflect both their extraordinary resilience and the unaddressed wounds they were working around. The machines that were present during the first contact period are not all the same as the machines operating on the surface today. The arc's deployment has evolved over time. New types of machines have appeared. Some early variants have not been seen in a long time. This evolution is one of the more unsettling aspects of the current situation, because it suggests that whatever is driving the arc's activities is adaptive and responsive to changed conditions. The arc is not executing a fixed, unchanging program. It is doing something that evolves. What is driving that evolution, what the arc is optimizing for, is one of the central unanswered questions in the lore. The early experiences of underground life, during and after the first contact period, established cultural practices and physical arrangements that became the foundation of the tunnel civilization. The way food was grown and distributed, the way labor was organized, the way conflicts were managed, the way knowledge was preserved and transmitted, all of these foundational arrangements were established under the conditions of the first contact period and carry its marks. The urgency, the scarcity, the constant awareness of threat, all of these were present at the creation of the underground civilization and are embedded in its DNA. The records that exist from the first contact period are, collectively, one of the most important resources for understanding the Arc Raiders setting. They are also among the most contested and most carefully controlled resources in the tunnel civilization. Who has access to first contact records, what those records say, which parts of them are considered reliable, and which parts are disputed, are all politically sensitive questions. The control of this historical information is a form of power, and the actors who exercise that control use it to shape the tunnel civilization's understanding of itself and its situation. The gap between what the records actually show and what the tunnel civilization's official history claims, they show is potentially significant. The experience of the first contact period is not entirely in the past. In one important sense, humanity is still living through the consequences of that first contact. The Ark is still here. The tunnel civilization is still underground because of what happened during the first contact period. Every raiding operation, every encounter with Ark machines on the surface, every planning decision made by tunnel leadership is shaped by the events of that period. First contact was not an episode that ended and gave way to something else. It was the beginning of a condition that has persisted for the entire history of the underground civilization, and it shows no clear signs of ending. The children who were young during the first contact period and who are now elders in the tunnel civilization occupy a specific cultural position that bridges the pre-Ark world and the underground world. They remember things that younger people only know from stories. They have a bodily, sensory relationship to the surface world that cannot be transmitted through testimony. The smell of outdoor air, the feeling of direct sunlight, the spatial experience of an open horizon. These things are not academic knowledge for the first contact generation. They are memories. And the loss of those memories, as this generation ages, is a form of cultural loss that the tunnel civilization will never fully recover from. The oral traditions that developed in the early tunnel communities to transmit the experiences of the first contact period are a distinct form of knowledge from the written records. They carry different things, emphasize different aspects, preserve different kinds of detail. The stories told around fires or in community meetings, passed from parents to children, are not simple, decorative additions to the historical record. They are a parallel record that sometimes preserves things the written record missed and sometimes distorts or mythologizes things the written record got right. Reading both together gives a richer and more honest picture than either alone. The material culture of the first contact period, the objects people made or modified during that chaotic transition, is scattered throughout the surface world and the oldest parts of the tunnel infrastructure. These objects tell the story of people improvising under pressure, making do with what they had, solving immediate problems with whatever was at hand. They are the material evidence of human ingenuity and adaptability at its most strained and most genuine. They are also, in some cases, the objects that made the difference between survival and death, and recognizing them as such gives them a weight that goes beyond their physical character. The first contact period was, above all, a period of loss. The scale of what was lost in human life, in knowledge, in cultural continuity, in physical infrastructure, in ecological integrity, is almost impossible to fully enumerate. But that loss was not uniform. Different communities lost different things in different proportions. Some communities lost almost everything. Others managed to preserve significant amounts. The unevenness of that loss is part of the unevenness of the tunnel civilization that emerged from it. Understanding what was lost and where helps understand what the current underground world is working with and what it is missing. The first contact period also saw genuine examples of extraordinary human behavior, of courage, self-sacrifice, and creative problem-solving under conditions that would break most people. These examples are real and important and worth honouring. But they should not be allowed to obscure the more complicated picture of a civilization failing at scale. The heroes of the first contact period operated within a context of massive systemic failure, and their heroism, while real, did not change that fundamental context. The tunnel civilization's tendency to focus on the heroes of the first contact period as its origin story is understandable but potentially misleading about what actually determined the outcome. The ongoing significance of the first contact period for understanding current events in the Ark Raiders world is hard to overstate. The political structures of the tunnel civilization were shaped by it. The technological trajectory of the underground world was shaped by it. The cultural values and fears of the tunnel population were shaped by it. the specific capabilities and limitations of the raiding operations that are the game's central activity were shaped by it. To understand Ark Raiders is, in an important sense, to understand the First Contact period and its long shadow. Everything in the present is downstream of what happened then. The question that the First Contact period ultimately leaves open is the one that drives the rest of the lore. Why did the Ark come? What is it doing here? Is the process it is executing something that can be interrupted or reversed? And if so, by whom, using what means, toward what end? The First Contact period posed these questions by making them urgently practical rather than abstractly philosophical. The survival of the tunnel civilization may ultimately depend on answering them. The search for those answers is what Ark Raiders is really about, and understanding where the search started in the chaos and catastrophe of the First Contact is essential for following where it leads. The First Contact period is over, in the sense that it was a distinct historical phase that has given way to the more stable, if still precarious, situation of the present, but its effects are everywhere in the world of Ark Raiders, in the machines that still patrol the surface, in the tunnels where humanity persists, in the tools raiders carry and the knowledge they rely on, in the questions that nobody has yet been able to answer. The First Contact was the beginning of the story, and the story is still going. Chapter 3. The Tunnels. The tunnel civilization is the most intimate part of the Ark Raiders world from a human perspective, because it is where the human characters live, and where the emotional stakes of the story are rooted. Understanding the tunnels, what they are, how they were built, how they function, and what kind of life they contain, is essential for understanding the people who make raiding runs to the surface, and why those runs matter beyond the immediate objective of bringing back supplies. The tunnels are home, but they are a specific kind of home, built under specific constraints, carrying specific histories, and shaped by specific pressures that distinguish them from any surface notion of what a home might look like. The physical structure of the tunnel system is one of the first things you notice when paying attention to the world building in Ark Raiders. The tunnels are not a single unified infrastructure. They are a composite of different generations of construction, different design philosophies, different levels of resources and planning. The oldest sections, the spaces that were part of pre-existing underground infrastructure before the invasion, have a different character from the spaces that were excavated during the early invasion period, which have a different character, again, from the more deliberately planned construction that happened once the tunnel communities had enough stability to think about building for the long term rather than just for immediate survival. The engineering challenges of maintaining and expanding an underground civilization are significant and ongoing. The tunnel communities developed over time a sophisticated engineering culture oriented specifically toward underground construction and maintenance. This culture built on pre-Ark underground engineering knowledge, but also developed new techniques, new tools, new approaches to the specific problems posed by long-term underground habitation. The people who maintain the tunnel infrastructure are among the most practically important members of the underground civilization, even if they are not always the most culturally prominent. When the tunnels are safe and functional, people can afford to forget about the engineers. When something goes wrong, the engineers are the first people everyone needs. The agricultural systems that keep the tunnel civilization fed are a marvel of engineering and biology, adapted over generations to the specific constraints of underground food production. The absence of sunlight, the limitations on space, the need to manage water and air quality in a closed system, all of these challenges produced agricultural solutions that look very different from surface farming, but have their own elegance. The people who work in tunnel agriculture are among the most knowledgeable about biology and biochemistry in the underground world, because keeping food production systems functional underground requires a deep understanding of the systems involved. This knowledge is valuable far beyond the agricultural context. The air management systems of the tunnel civilization are one of the less glamorous but most essential aspects of the underground infrastructure. Managing breathable air in a sealed underground space requires constant work, both mechanical and biological. The combination of mechanical ventilation, chemical scrubbing, and biological processes that the tunnel communities use to maintain air quality represents a sophisticated engineering achievement that is easy to take for granted, but impossible to survive without. The people who maintain these systems are specialists with knowledge that is essentially irreplaceable, which gives them a specific kind of power within the tunnel communities. The water systems of the tunnel civilization reflect both the pre-Ark world's investment in underground water infrastructure and the subsequent adaptations made to maintain and extend it. Access to water is one of the most fundamental requirements of any human community, and the tunnel communities have developed multiple overlapping systems for securing that access. Natural underground water sources, captured surface runoff, recycled wastewater, all of these contribute to the water supply. The management of these systems, including the constant monitoring for Ark-related contamination, is a significant, ongoing task that shapes the daily life of the tunnel communities in ways that surface dwellers might find surprising. The social structure of the tunnel civilization reflects both the pre-Ark world social organization and the specific conditions of underground life. Pre-Ark social categories, professions, class distinctions, all of these were disrupted by the invasion, but not entirely dissolved. The people who came into the tunnels brought their pre-Ark social habits and expectations with them, and those habits shaped how the early tunnel communities organized themselves. Over time, the specific demands of underground survival modified this inherited social structure, creating new forms of status and new modes of organization. But the pre-Ark influences remain visible in the current social organization of the tunnel world. The governance structures of the tunnel communities are diverse and reflect the different origins and development trajectories of different communities. Some communities developed relatively egalitarian structures, making decisions through collective processes. Others developed more hierarchical arrangements, concentrating authority in specific individuals or groups. The interaction between these different governance models, as tunnel communities that developed separately have come into contact and had to negotiate relationships with each other, is one of the most interesting political dynamics in the current period of Ark Raiders lore. The question of how to coordinate across different governance traditions without destroying the specific character of each community is one that the tunnel civilization has not fully solved. The educational system of the tunnel civilization is one of its most important and most contested institutions. What children are taught, who gets to decide what they're taught, how knowledge is organized and transmitted across generations. These are questions with enormous practical and political stakes in the underground world. The preservation of knowledge from the pre-Ark world is a central concern of tunnel education. But what to preserve and what to emphasize is not a neutral question. The selection of knowledge for transmission is a form of power, and the people who control that selection have a significant influence on the future trajectory of the tunnel civilization. The cultural life of the tunnel communities is richer and more varied than an outsider might expect from a survival-oriented underground civilization. Music, storytelling, visual art, performance, games, all of these forms of human cultural expression have persisted and developed within the tunnel world. The specific forms they have taken reflect both the inheritance from the pre-Ark world and the specific conditions and concerns of underground life. The art of the tunnel world is not a pale imitation of surface culture. It is a genuine cultural tradition that has grown from the unique experience of the underground civilization, and it carries things that surface culture never could. The memory of the surface world in the tunnel civilization's cultural life is a complex and emotionally charged subject. For the generations who remember the surface directly, that memory is personal and sensory, and sometimes overwhelming in its emotional weight. For the generations born underground, the surface is known only through stories, records, and the evidence brought back by raiders. The relationship between these two kinds of knowledge of the surface, direct memory versus constructed understanding, shapes the tunnel culture's relationship to the surface in ways that matter for understanding why raiding is valued not just instrumentally, but emotionally and culturally. The relationship between different tunnel communities is one of the most politically charged aspects of the current situation in Ark Raiders. Communities that developed independently, with different histories, different resources, different governance structures, and different relationships to the pre-Ark world's social hierarchies, must now negotiate shared interests and manage conflicts that arise from their differences. The specific alliances and tensions between communities form the political landscape of the tunnel world, and understanding this landscape is important for understanding the factions and motivations that shape raiding activities and their outcomes. The role of raiders in the tunnel civilization is not reducible to the simple function of supply procurement. Raiders are also the primary interface between the underground world and the surface, the people who generate current knowledge about Ark behavior and surface conditions. They are cultural figures whose experiences and stories feed the collective imagination of the tunnel communities. They are, in some cases, political figures whose activities have implications beyond their immediate missions. The place of raiders in the tunnel civilization is elevated in ways that go beyond their practical contribution, and that elevation carries both privileges and responsibilities. The economy of the tunnel civilization is built on a combination of scarcity management, internal production, and the import of surface materials by raiders. The balance between these inputs and the way the tunnel economy manages the distribution of what is available reflects the political and social priorities of the communities involved. Some communities have more egalitarian distribution systems, others have more stratified ones, where access to better food, better quarters, better equipment is correlated with status and power. The economic diversity of the tunnel world is a source of both resilience and tension. The medical systems of the tunnel civilization have been adapted to the specific challenges of underground life. The absence of certain resources available on the surface, the presence of specific underground health challenges, the management of the psychological consequences of living underground without natural light or open space, all of these have required the development of specific medical approaches. The tunnel civilization's medical knowledge is in some ways more advanced than the pre-Ark worlds in the specific domains most relevant to underground life, even as it lacks access to certain technologies and resources that the surface world had. The relationship between the tunnel civilization and the surface is not simply one of threat and avoidance. The surface is also the source of many of the resources the tunnel communities need and cannot produce underground. The raiding economy is built on this dependency, and the dependency shapes the culture, politics, and social organization of the tunnel communities in fundamental ways. The surface is dangerous and hostile, but it is also necessary. That combination of danger and necessity creates a specific emotional and cultural relationship to the surface that is central to the Ark Raiders world. The psychological experience of living underground, cut off from natural light, from open space, from the sky, is one of the most significant ongoing challenges of the tunnel civilization. The human organism is not adapted for permanent underground habitation, and the consequences of this mismatch, while manageable, are real and ongoing. The tunnel communities have developed various strategies for managing these psychological challenges, from the use of artificial lighting that mimics natural light cycles to cultural practices that maintain a connection to the idea of the surface. The effectiveness of these strategies varies, and the psychological health of tunnel populations is an ongoing concern for community leadership. The children of the tunnel civilization, born underground and never having seen the surface, have a different relationship to their world than any previous generation in human history. They are adapted, both culturally and psychologically, to underground life in ways that their parents are not. They do not experience the tunnels as a diminished version of the world that should be. They experience them as the world. This adaptation is valuable and resilient, but it also represents a form of disconnection from the surface world and the pre-Ark civilization that has complicated implications for the long-term trajectory of the tunnel civilization. The folklore and mythology that has developed in the tunnel civilization around the surface world and the Ark is a rich and complex body of cultural material that tells you a great deal about the fears, hopes, and values of the underground communities. The Ark in particular has acquired mythological dimensions that go beyond its practical reality as a physical threat. In the stories and beliefs of the tunnel communities, the Ark is not just a set of dangerous machines. It is a symbol sometimes of punishment, sometimes of power, sometimes of mystery, that carries the weight of the civilization's deepest anxieties about its own situation. Understanding these mythological dimensions is important for understanding the culture of the tunnel world. The physical layout of the tunnel communities reflects the specific history and priorities of each community. The arrangement of living spaces, communal areas, working spaces, and critical infrastructure tells a story about how each community has made decisions about what to prioritize and how to organize shared life. The diversity of these arrangements across different communities is one of the ways in which the tunnel civilization's decentralized development has produced genuine variety within the shared constraints of underground existence. The role of the elderly in the tunnel civilization is particularly significant given the specific form of knowledge they carry. Elders who remember the pre-Ark world, who lived through the first contact period, who are present at the founding of specific tunnel communities, are living repositories of irreplaceable knowledge and experience. Their role as bearers of historical memory, as bridges between the pre-Ark world and the current underground civilization, is recognized and valued in most tunnel communities. As this generation ages and its numbers thin, the urgency of capturing and transmitting what they know becomes more acute. The technical knowledge required to maintain the tunnel civilization's infrastructure is among the most carefully preserved and transmitted knowledge in the underground world. The engineering, chemistry, biology, and materials science needed to keep the tunnels functioning, the air clean, the water safe, the food growing, the power running, all of this knowledge is critically important and carefully curated. The people who hold this technical knowledge are essential to the tunnel civilization's survival, and the systems for training and developing the next generation of technical specialists are among the most important educational institutions in the underground world. The relationship between the tunnel civilization and time is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the lore. Underground, removed from natural light cycles and the rhythms of surface seasons, the experience of time is mediated entirely by artificial systems. The tunnel communities maintain their own timekeeping, their own calendar, their own rhythm of days and seasons, but the relationship of these human constructs to any external natural reality is mediated rather than direct. The question of how people understand time, history, and their own place in a temporal flow, when that flow is constructed rather than given, is one of the more subtle aspects of what makes the tunnel civilization different from any previous human culture. The archives and libraries of the tunnel civilization are among its most important institutions, and they are also among its most politically significant. What is preserved? What is accessible? What is considered important enough to maintain in multiple copies versus what is allowed to exist in a single vulnerable form? All of these decisions reflect the values and priorities of the people who make them. The collection of pre-Ark knowledge and the collection of knowledge generated since the invasion are managed differently in most communities, and the politics of archival management is a real and sometimes contested aspect of tunnel governance. The relationship between the tunnel civilization and pre-ark religion and spirituality is complex and varied across different communities. Some communities have maintained or modified pre-ark religious traditions. Others have developed entirely new spiritual frameworks oriented around the specific experience of underground existence and the ongoing threat of the ark. Still others have developed explicitly non-religious frameworks for making meaning of their situation. The diversity of spiritual and philosophical orientations across the tunnel communities reflects the diversity of their pre-ark inheritances and the range of responses that human beings have to the kind of existential challenge the ark represents. The craft and manufacturing traditions of the tunnel civilization represent a sophisticated adaptation of pre-ark industrial knowledge to the specific constraints of underground production. Without access to the full range of surface materials and the full scale of surface industrial infrastructure, the tunnel communities have developed forms of production that are more artisanal, more adaptive, and in some ways more innovative than the industrial production they replaced. The people who design and make the equipment and tools of the tunnel civilization are not just following inherited instructions. They are continuously adapting and inventing within the constraints they face. The political relationships between the tunnel civilization and the ark are mediated almost entirely through the raiding economy and the knowledge raiders bring back. The tunnel communities do not have the ability to engage the ark directly on their own terms, except defensively when ark machines breach the surface boundary. The asymmetry between the ark's capabilities and the tunnel civilization's capabilities is a fundamental political fact that shapes how the underground communities think about their own situation and their long-term prospects. The question of whether this asymmetry can ever be meaningfully changed is one of the most important strategic questions facing the tunnel civilization. The role of humor in the tunnel civilization's culture is worth noting because it tells you something important about how people manage the psychological weight of their situation. The comedy of the underground world, the jokes that circulate in the communities, the comedic traditions in storytelling and performance are not escapism from the serious reality of tunnel life. They are a form of engagement with it. The specific things that people in the tunnel civilization find funny, the anxieties and frustrations they process through humor, are windows into the psychological life of the underground world that are as revealing as the more serious cultural forms. The relationship between individual tunnel communities and any kind of broader tunnel civilization consciousness is one of the most interesting and unresolved aspects of the current law. Different communities have different levels of connection to each other, different degrees of coordination and shared identity. The question of whether the tunnel communities are developing toward a more unified civilization, or whether the centrifugal forces of their different histories and circumstances are pulling them apart, is one of the most important political questions of the current period. The answer has enormous implications for the tunnel civilization's ability to address the challenge of the ark. The specific ways in which the tunnel communities have adapted pre-ark technologies for underground use are a rich area of the law that the game communicates primarily through the design of the equipment and environment. The creative modifications of pre-ark tech visible in tunnel infrastructure tell stories about specific engineering problems and specific solutions found under constraint. Following these design decisions, tracing where a technology came from and what was done to it to make it work underground is one of the more engaging forms of lore exploration available in the Ark Raiders world. The natural world underground is limited compared to the surface ecology, but it is not absent. The tunnels have their own ecology, adapted to the specific conditions of underground existence. The communities that have learned to work with and manage this underground ecology rather than fighting it have found valuable resources and functional systems. The relationship between the tunnel civilization and the living systems that share its underground environment is not purely antagonistic. In many cases, it is mutually beneficial in ways that have been discovered through long experience. The music of the tunnel civilization is one of its most developed and most emotionally significant cultural forms. Made under specific acoustic conditions that differ from surface music, shaped by the specific experiences and anxieties of underground existence, informed by but not limited by the musical traditions of the pre-arc world, tunnel music is a genuine artistic tradition. The people who make it are artists in the fullest sense, creating work that speaks to the specific human experience of living in the Arc Raiders world, and that work carries things that no other form of cultural expression quite does. The specific physical experience of tunnel life, the constrained spaces, the artificial light, the constant background noise of infrastructure, the particular smells and temperatures and physical sensations of underground existence shapes the bodies and habits of the people who live there in ways that distinguish them from the pre-arc surface population. These physical adaptations are part of what makes the tunnel civilization a genuinely distinct culture, rather than just a displaced version of the surface world. The people of the tunnels are not just surface people who happen to be underground. They are something new, formed by their specific circumstances. The relationship between the tunnel civilization and the concept of the future is one of the most important aspects of its cultural and political life. The pre-arc world had a specific relationship to the future, full of expectations and plans and investments in things that would not pay off for years or decades. The invasion disrupted that relationship fundamentally. The early tunnel communities were focused entirely on the immediate, on survival from day to day. Over time, as the immediate crisis stabilized into something more chronic and manageable, the ability to think about the future returned. But the relationship to the future in the tunnel civilization is different from the pre-arc worlds. It is more qualified, more aware of uncertainty, more focused on resilience than on expansion. The security arrangements of the tunnel communities reflect both the ongoing threat of arc incursion and the internal political tensions that exist within and between communities. Security is not a neutral function in the tunnel world. It is a form of power, and the people and institutions that control security have influence that goes beyond the strictly protective function. The history of how different communities have organized their security and the abuses and successes that have resulted is part of the political history of the tunnel civilization that shapes current attitudes and arrangements. The relationship between official knowledge and unofficial knowledge in the tunnel civilization is one of the recurring themes in Arc Raiders lore. What is officially known, officially taught, officially considered reliable about the Arc and about the pre-Arc world is not always the same as what is known unofficially, passed through informal channels, preserved in personal records, or accumulated through the individual experience of raiders who have seen things that do not fit neatly into official narratives. The gap between these two bodies of knowledge is a source of political tension, and navigating it is part of what makes the social life of the tunnel civilization complex and interesting. The architectural evolution of tunnel construction over the generations since the invasion traces the development of the tunnel civilization's engineering culture and its changing understanding of its own permanence. Early construction is characterized by urgency and improvisation. Middle period construction shows more planning and investment in permanence. Recent construction in the more established communities shows something closer to deliberate aesthetic choices being made alongside functional ones, a sign that the civilization has reached a level of stability where beauty and comfort have become legitimate considerations rather than luxuries that cannot be afforded. The relationship between the tunnel civilization and its own history is actively contested rather than settled. Different communities tell different versions of the story of their own founding, different versions of the invasion, different accounts of what happened during the first contact period. These competing histories reflect not just genuine differences in evidence and interpretation, but political stakes, the ways in which different versions of history support or undermine the authority of different current actors and institutions. The politics of history in the tunnel civilization is not abstract, it is immediate and consequential. The tunnel civilization's relationship with the concept of hope is one of the most emotionally resonant aspects of the Ark Raiders world. Living permanently underground, under the threat of machines that drove humanity there, with no clear prospect of returning to the surface on humanity's own terms. The question of what people hope for, how they maintain the emotional capacity to care about the future, is one of the most fundamentally human aspects of the setting. The answer varies by community, by individual, by generation, but the persistence of hope in some form, across all the difficulty and loss of the tunnel civilization's history, is one of the things that makes the human side of Ark Raiders genuinely moving. The specific ways in which the tunnel civilization has failed, the experiments that did not work out, the communities that did not survive, the decisions that turned out to be wrong, are as important for understanding the setting as the successes. The tunnel civilization is not a story of unbroken triumph against impossible odds. It is a story of human beings doing their best under extreme conditions, which means it includes failure alongside resilience. Those failures, when they can be recovered from the historical record, are some of the most important lore material in the setting, because they tell you what the limits of the tunnel civilization's capabilities and wisdom actually are. The question of how long the tunnel civilization can sustain itself without some resolution to the Ark situation is one that the lore raises without fully answering. The resources available underground are finite. The biological and psychological costs of permanent underground life are real and accumulating. The political strains within and between tunnel communities are not easing. The long-term trajectory of the tunnel civilization, without some change in its relationship to the surface, points toward a situation that becomes progressively harder to sustain. This is not immediate catastrophe, but it is a direction that creates urgency, that makes the questions Raiders are trying to answer on the surface not just interesting but existentially important. Chapter 4. Who are the Raiders? The Raiders of the Ark Raiders world are the most complex and interesting human element in the lore, precisely because they occupy a position that is fundamentally unlike any other in the tunnel civilization. They are the people who go above. In a culture that defines safety as underground and death as the surface, the choice to go to the surface regularly, to make a life out of descending into the most dangerous environment that exists, is a choice that requires a particular kind of person, a particular combination of skill and temperament and motivation. Understanding who the Raiders are, as individuals and as a social category, is essential for understanding the human dimension of Ark Raiders lore. The path to becoming a Raider is different in different communities and different circumstances, but there are common elements that appear consistently. Training is universal. No community sends people to the surface without preparation, because unprepared people die very quickly up there. The nature and duration of that training varies, but it always includes some version of Ark machine recognition and behavior, navigation of the surface environment, operation of surface-appropriate equipment, and the specific protocols the community uses for coordination and communication during a raiding run. The training is practical and based on accumulated experience, not theoretical. Raiders learn from people who have done it, and what they learn reflects what those people learned from doing it. The motivations for becoming a Raider are as varied as the individuals who make that choice. For some, it is primarily economic. Raiders in most tunnel communities have access to better resources and more comfortable living situations than non-Raiders, a compensation for the risk they take. For others, the motivation is more personal, a need for the specific kind of freedom and challenge that surface runs provide, a psychological requirement for open space and danger that underground life does not supply. For others still, the motivation is more idealistic, a genuine belief that what raiders do matters for the long-term survival of the tunnel civilization, and a willingness to risk their lives in service of that belief. Most raiders are probably driven by some combination of all three. The psychological profile of a successful raider is specific in ways that are worth examining. Not everyone who tries raiding is suited to it. The specific combination of qualities required, the ability to make rapid decisions under extreme stress, the capacity to remain calm and observant while being hunted by machines that can kill you, the tolerance for the isolation and physical hardship of surface runs, these qualities are not universal. People who lack them do not become long-term successful raiders. The communities have learned, through painful experience, what the markers of those qualities look like and how to identify them in potential raiders before they end up in situations that kill them and the people around them. The physical demands of raiding are significant and shape the bodies and health of active raiders in specific ways. The surface environment requires different kinds of physical adaptation than the tunnel environment, and maintaining the fitness to operate effectively on the surface while living underground requires dedicated effort. The physical culture of raiding communities is distinct from the broader tunnel culture, oriented towards specific functional capacities rather than the general physical maintenance that the tunnel environment requires. Raiders are among the physically most capable people in the tunnel civilization, and that physical capacity is part of what defines the social identity of the raider. The equipment raiders carry is a synthesis of modified pre-arc technology, tunnel-manufactured gear, and items recovered from previous surface runs. The specific assemblage of equipment any given raider carries reflects their experience, their mission objectives, their personal preferences shaped by previous surface encounters, and the resources their community has available. There is significant variation in raiding equipment across communities and individuals, and that variation is itself a form of law, because what different raiders have chosen to carry and why is a record of their accumulated surface experience. The relationships between raiders, the bonds formed through shared experience of surface runs, are among the most intense and durable relationships in the tunnel civilization. The experience of being on the surface together, of depending on each other for survival under conditions that regularly test that dependence, creates a specific kind of trust and loyalty that is hard to replicate in any other context. Raiding teams that survive together develop a functioning intimacy, a knowledge of each other's capabilities and limitations and tendencies that makes them more effective as a unit and more connected as people. The dissolution of a raiding team, through death or circumstance, is always a significant loss. The culture of raiding teams is distinct from broader tunnel culture in ways that reflect the specific experience of surface work. The humour is darker. The relationship to death is more immediate and less abstract. The hierarchy within teams is functional rather than social, based on demonstrated capability rather than tunnel status. The specific etiquette of raiding culture, the unspoken rules and expectations that govern how raiders treat each other and conduct themselves on the surface, is a distinct social code that marks raiders as a community within the broader community of the tunnel civilization. The relationship between raiders and the communities they come from is not simple. Raiders are valued and often celebrated, but they are also slightly apart from the rest of the community, operating in a domain that most community members will never experience and that many fear. This slight apartness can manifest as elevation and admiration, or it can manifest as suspicion and distance, depending on the community and the specific raider. Some raiders are heroes in their communities. Others are more marginal figures whose relationship with the community's official life is complicated by the independence and unconventionality that surface work tends to produce. The question of what raiders think and feel about the Ark machines they regularly encounter is one of the most interesting aspects of the raider character in Ark Raiders lore. For most tunnel residents, the Ark is an abstract threat, known through stories and official information rather than direct experience. For raiders, the Ark is immediate and personal. They have encountered it under conditions of extreme stress and vulnerability. They have watched it kill people they cared about. They have survived encounters that had no right to be survivable. The relationship that develops from this direct experience is complex. It is not simply fear, though fear is part of it. It is something more like a deep, complicated familiarity with something that is genuinely alien. The deaths of raiders are processed differently in tunnel culture than the deaths of non-raiders. Raiding is a known, chosen risk. The people who become raiders understand that they may not come back from every run, and the communities they come from understand this too. The cultural frameworks for mourning raider deaths are shaped by this understanding, by the tension between grief and acceptance, between honouring the person and acknowledging the choice they made. Raider memorials and mourning traditions are a distinct cultural form in the tunnel world, and they carry a specific weight that comes from the combination of love and loss and acceptance that they must contain. The experiences that raiders bring back from the surface, not just the physical materials but the knowledge, the observations, the stories, are a crucial input into the tunnel civilization's understanding of the world above. Raiders are, in this sense, also explorers and researchers, generating knowledge about an environment that most of the tunnel population can only know at second hand. The quality and reliability of this knowledge depends on the quality and attention of the raiders themselves, and the best raiders are not just skilled survivors but careful observers, people who pay attention to what they see and think about what it means and bring that thinking back alongside the physical goods they carry. The leadership structures within raiding teams reflect the specific demands of surface work. The person who leads a raiding team is typically the person with the most experience and the best judgment for surface conditions, not necessarily the person with the highest status in the tunnel community. This meritocratic tendency within raiding culture is sometimes in tension with the more status-oriented governance of the tunnel communities that sponsors and depends on raiding operations. The relationship between raiding team leadership and tunnel community leadership is one of the recurring political tensions in the Ark Raiders world. The role of women in the raiding community is worth noting specifically because it reflects a broader aspect of tunnel civilization social dynamics. The physical demands of raiding are real, but not exclusively oriented toward typically male physical characteristics. The mental demands of raiding, the decision-making, the observation, the adaptability, the ability to function under extreme stress are not gender differentiated. In most tunnel communities, the raiding community includes people of all genders, and the evaluation of raiders is based primarily on demonstrated capability rather than demographic category. This is not universal across all tunnel communities, and the communities where gender determines access to raiding are an interesting lore thread in their own right. The aging of raiders is one of the more poignant aspects of the raider character arc. Physical raiding has limits imposed by age and cumulative injury. The specific physical demands of surface work become harder to meet over time, and the accumulated injuries that active raiders typically carry make the work progressively more difficult. The transition from active raiding to other roles is a significant life event for many raiders, involving both loss and adaptation. The knowledge that long-experienced raiders carry, the specific surface expertise they have accumulated, is too valuable to waste, and most tunnel communities have developed roles for experienced former raiders that make use of their knowledge while acknowledging their changed physical circumstances. The relationship between veterans of raiding and new recruits is one of the most important transmission mechanisms for raiding knowledge and culture. The knowledge that makes a raider effective is not fully capturable in training materials or written records. Much of it is tacit, embodied in habits and reflexes developed through experience. The transmission of this knowledge requires close working relationships between veterans and newer raiders, and the culture of mentorship within raiding communities is one of the things that makes those communities function effectively over time. When that mentorship culture breaks down, through attrition of experienced raiders or through the disruption of raiding community practices, the consequences are visible in outcomes on the surface. The specific ARC machines that raiders encounter most commonly on the surface have acquired names and personalities in raiding culture that go beyond their technical designations. The naming and characterization of ARC machines by the raiding community reflects both the intimacy of their experience with these machines and the human tendency to personify entities that have significant power over one's survival. These informal names and characterizations are a form of cultural knowledge, a way of encoding useful behavioral information in a memorable form. They are also a form of coping, a way of humanizing the inhuman in order to make it legible and manageable. The spiritual and psychological practices that raiders use to manage the stresses of surface work are varied and personal. Some raiders have formal practices, rituals that mark the beginning and end of surface runs, that create psychological transitions between the underground and surface modes of existence. Others have more informal habits and superstitions. Some have highly rationalized, secular frameworks for managing the stress. Others draw on religious or quasi-religious traditions. What is common across the variation is the recognition that the psychological demands of raiding are real and require active management, that you cannot simply ignore the stress and expect it not to accumulate. The financial aspects of raiding, how raiders are compensated, how the value of what they bring back is determined and distributed, are a significant aspect of the raiding economy and the tunnel civilization's broader economic life. Different communities handle this differently, with different mixes of collective reward, individual compensation, and resource allocation based on risk and outcome. The economics of raiding shapes who becomes a raider and under what conditions, and the specific economic arrangements of different communities produce different social and political dynamics within the raiding population. The relationships between raiders from different tunnel communities are a form of diplomacy as much as a form of professional interaction. When raiders from different communities encounter each other on the surface, the dynamics of that encounter are shaped by both the immediate practical context, two groups of armed, stressed people moving through dangerous territory, and the broader political relationships between their home communities. Raiders from allied communities might collaborate and share information. Raiders from communities in political tension might be wary or actively hostile. The surface is not neutral ground in the political sense, even if the ARC doesn't care about tunnel politics. The stories that raiders tell about the surface world, in informal gatherings, in more formal community contexts, in the records they make of their experiences, are one of the primary forms of cultural production in the tunnel civilization. Raider narrative is a specific genre with its own conventions and expectations. It tends towards specificity and concrete detail rather than abstraction. It balances drama with the practical information that future raiders need. It develops characters, both human and machine, with the kind of particularity that comes from a direct experience. The best raider storytellers are artists as well as witnesses, and the tradition they work in is one of the tunnel civilization's most important cultural forms. The institutional structures that organize raiding operations differ significantly across different tunnel communities. Some communities have formal raiding organizations with clear hierarchies, standardized training, and systematic allocation of missions. Others have more informal arrangements, where individual raiders or small teams operate with significant independence, selling or trading their services and the materials they bring back. The specific organizational form of raiding in a given community reflects the community's broader governance philosophy and the specific history of how its raiding culture developed. Neither the formal nor the informal model is clearly superior in all circumstances, and most communities have settled into hybrid arrangements that combine elements of both. The physical toll of multiple surface runs on a raider's body and mind is one of the more difficult aspects of the raider experience that the law acknowledges. The ARC machines cause injuries that are not always fully treatable with underground medical resources. The environmental conditions of the surface, the contamination, the physical demands of moving through the landscape add up over many runs, and the psychological accumulation of repeated near-death experiences, of watching colleagues die, of carrying the stress of surface work across many missions, produces effects that do not simply resolve between runs. Long active raiders carry their history in their bodies and their minds, and that history shapes who they are as people as much as it shapes their effectiveness as raiders. The community that raiders form among themselves, across and within specific raiding teams, is in some ways the most important social unit in a raider's life. The intensity of shared surface experience creates bonds that are often more immediate and functionally important than community bonds. The raider community has its own internal social life, its own way of resolving conflicts and managing relationships, its own standards of behavior and accountability. This internal culture is both a strength because it creates the trust and coordination that makes effective raiding possible, and a potential source of tension with the broader tunnel communities that raiders are embedded in. The long-term psychological trajectory of people who raid actively for years is not a topic the official tunnel culture necessarily likes to discuss, but it is an important aspect of the law. Some raiders remain psychologically intact through long careers and transition successfully to other roles when their surface work winds down. Others accumulate damage that makes their post-raiding lives difficult. The tunnel civilization's capacity to support former raiders in managing the long-term effects of their service varies by community, and the failures in this area are part of the debt that the tunnel civilization owes to the people who take the greatest risks on its behalf. The specific knowledge that raiders accumulate about ARC machine behavior and the surface environment is not just individually valuable. It is collectively one of the most important scientific and strategic resources the tunnel civilization has. The systematic collection and analysis of raider observations would be enormously valuable, and some communities have made more progress on this than others. The challenges are significant. Raider experience is often traumatic and fragmentary. The conditions under which observations are made are not controlled. The communication of what was observed is shaped by the narrative conventions of raiding culture rather than the analytical conventions of systematic research. But the information is there, and its systematic development is one of the most important projects in the tunnel civilization. The relationship between raiders and the political leadership of tunnel communities is one of the more interesting sources of tension in the ARC Raiders world. Raiders have capabilities and knowledge that give them a kind of independent power, an ability to act outside the community and bring back resources that the community depends on. That is not reducible to the authority that community leadership formally commands. The best community leaders understand how to work with this dynamic rather than against it. The worst try to control it in ways that ultimately undermine the effectiveness of the raiding operations the community needs. The moments of discovery on the surface, when a raider finds something unexpected, something that doesn't fit the established picture of the surface world or the ARC, are among the most significant events in the ARC Raiders lore, because they are the primary mechanism through which the tunnel civilization's understanding of the surface and the ARC actually changes. Most raiding runs confirm existing expectations, but occasionally something is found that challenges those expectations. How the raider and the raiders community respond to that discovery, whether they investigate further or set it aside, whether they report it officially or share it only informally, shapes the tunnel civilization's ability to learn from the surface in ways that go beyond material procurement. The emotional relationship that raiders develop with the surface landscape, despite and because of its danger, is one of the more surprising aspects of the raider experience. Many long-active raiders report a complicated emotional response to the surface that includes genuine appreciation for aspects of the environment, the open sky, the physical scale of the landscape, the sensory richness, even where that richness includes contamination and the evidence of destruction. The surface is terrifying, but it is also, for people who spend most of their lives in the constraint of underground spaces, overwhelming in its scope and presence. That complicated emotional relationship to the surface shapes raiders in ways that their tunnel-bound colleagues sometimes find difficult to understand. The raider who comes back from a run different from how they left is one of the recurring figures in tunnel civilization narrative. Something seen, something experienced, something discovered on the surface that changes a person's relationship to what they thought they knew. These transformative experiences are individual, but they are also part of a broader pattern of the surface generating knowledge and insight that challenges the settled understanding of the underground world. The raiders who bring those challenges back, who insist on taking seriously what they experienced, even when it is inconvenient, are among the most important contributors to the tunnel civilization's ability to adapt and respond to changed circumstances. The specific details of raiding operational practice, the protocols for entering and exiting the surface, for moving through the surface environment, for responding to ARC machine contact, for emergency procedures when things go wrong, represent an accumulated body of practical knowledge that is among the most carefully maintained knowledge in the tunnel civilization. These protocols were developed through experience, often painful, and they reflect the hard-won lessons of many runs. They are not perfect or complete because the surface environment and ARC machine behavior are not static, but they represent the best current understanding of how to do this very dangerous thing as safely as possible. The network of information that exists within the raiding community, the informal channels through which observations, warnings, and discoveries flow between raiders and raiding teams, is one of the important features of the raiding culture that makes it more effective than it would otherwise be. Raiders share information that they do not always report through official channels, because the official channels are sometimes slow, sometimes filtered by political considerations, sometimes managed by people who do not fully understand the operational implications of what is being reported. The informal raider network is not a conspiracy. It is a practical response to the limits of formal information management in the tunnel civilization. The concept of a good raid and what makes it good varies between and within raiding communities. For some, a good raid is primarily defined by the value of what was brought back relative to the risk taken. For others, the primary measure is whether everyone who went out came back. For others still, a good raid is one where something was learned, where the knowledge of the surface was meaningfully advanced. The tension between these different measures of success is real and shapes the culture and practices of raiding teams in ways that are worth paying attention to. The politics of raiding missions, who decides what objectives to pursue, how resources for raiding are allocated, what happens to what raiders bring back, are a significant aspect of the broader political life of tunnel communities. Raiding is not a politically neutral activity. It is a major allocation of community resources and a major source of community income. The decisions that shape raiding operations are consequential, and the people who make those decisions have power. How that power is exercised, transparently or opaquely, in the community's broad interest or in narrower interests, is one of the recurring questions of tunnel community governance. The people who support raiders but do not raid themselves, the equipment maintainers, the medical personnel who treat raider injuries, the analysts who process raider intelligence, The trainers who prepare new raiders are part of the raiding community in an extended sense and part of its culture. The relationship between raiders and their support structures is one of the important social dynamics of raiding communities, involving both appreciation and sometimes tension. The people who make raiding possible without going to the surface themselves occupy a specific position in raiding culture, valued but not always fully included. The children of raiders have a specific experience of growing up that distinguishes them within the tunnel civilization. They grow up with a parent who goes away to a place that might kill them and comes back changed in ways that are not always easy to understand. The households of raiders, the specific dynamics of families where raiding is part of the parental identity, are a distinct social environment within the tunnel communities. The children who come from these households, who grow up understanding what raiding is from the inside, are disproportionately represented among the next generation of raiders, suggesting both cultural transmission and something harder to name, a specific orientation toward the surface world that is partly learned and partly something else. The technological evolution of raiding equipment over the history of the tunnel civilization tracks both the improvements in tunnel manufacturing capability and the accumulated learning about what works on the surface. The raiding kit of the early tunnel period was improvised and limited. The raiding kit of the current period is more sophisticated and purpose-built, but still shaped by constraint and the need for repairability and adaptability. The trajectory of raiding equipment development tells a story about the tunnel civilization's growing investment in and commitment to surface operations as a long-term strategic activity rather than a desperate improvisation. The way that raider deaths are handled, both practically in terms of the mission when a team member is lost on the surface, and emotionally in terms of how the loss is processed back in the community, is one of the most revealing aspects of raiding culture. The practical protocols for dealing with a team member's death on the surface, the decisions about what to do when, are not simply tactical. They reflect values about what raiders owe each other and what the mission owes the individual. Different teams handle this differently, and the differences are telling about the culture of specific raiding communities. The legacy of specific famous or legendary raiders in the tunnel civilization's culture is a significant aspect of raiding identity. Every active raiding community has its stories of exceptional individuals whose exploits became part of the community's narrative about itself. These stories, whether strictly accurate or not, serve a function beyond simple entertainment. They embody the community's understanding of what raiding excellence looks like, what values the raiding community most esteems, what kind of person a raider aspires to be. They are, in this sense, a form of normative cultural production, as much as historical record. The honest accounting of raiding failure, the missions that went wrong, the decisions that got people killed, the approaches that turned out to be mistakes, is as important for the development of raiding practice as the celebration of success. The communities that manage to be honest about failure, that create space for learning from it rather than explaining it away, develop better raiding practices over time. The communities that cannot tolerate honest failure analysis are condemned to repeat the same mistakes. The cultural and political conditions that enable or prevent honest failure analysis are one of the more important determinants of raiding community effectiveness. The question of what raiders ultimately want, beyond the immediate objectives of specific missions, is one of the deeper questions in the Ark Raiders lore. Many raiders are not simply doing a job, they are doing something that matters to them in a deeper sense, that connects to their sense of who they are and what is worth risking their life for. The variety of answers to this question across different raiders and different communities is a map of the tunnel civilization's deeper values and aspirations. The raiders who want to restore surface habitability, the raiders who are searching for specific things or people or answers, the raiders who are simply, in some irreducible way, people who cannot stay underground. All of these are real, and all of them shape the raiding culture in different ways. Chapter 5. The Ark Machines. The Ark Machines are the central mystery of the Ark Raiders world, and understanding them, or rather, understanding the limits and directions of our understanding of them, is essential for making sense of everything else in the lore. We know what Ark Machines look like, how they behave in various circumstances, what they are capable of doing to human beings and human infrastructure. We know much less about what drives them, what they are ultimately working toward, who or what built them, and whether there is any way to meaningfully interfere with their operations beyond the local and temporary. These are the questions that the lore raises without fully answering, and they are worth sitting with carefully. The physical construction of Ark Machines is one of the areas where the lore provides the most specific information, even if that information raises as many questions as it answers. The materials Ark Machines are made from are distinctive, differing from human-engineered metals and composites in ways that suggest either a different materials science tradition or access to materials not available from Earth sources. The physical structure of Ark Machines reflects engineering principles that are in some ways analogous to human engineering, and in other ways distinctly different. The similarities are interesting precisely because they suggest that some solutions to physical engineering problems are convergent, appearing independently in different engineering traditions. The differences are more interesting because they reveal something about the specific context and priorities of whoever built the Ark Machines. The behavioural repertoire of Ark Machines is one of the most carefully studied bodies of knowledge in the Tunnel civilization. Raiders who survive long surface careers develop an intuitive understanding of how different Ark machine types behave, what triggers different behavioural responses, how machines communicate and coordinate with each other. This knowledge is practical and life-saving, and it is also, at a deeper level, evidence about what the machines are doing and why. The behaviour of the machines reveals their functional priorities in ways that the machine's physical structure alone does not. Watching what a machine does, and particularly watching what it does when its normal activity is interrupted, tells you something about what that activity was actually for. The diversity of Ark machine types is one of the most significant facts about the Ark presence on the surface. These are not a single type of machine doing a single type of task. There are machines that appear to have primarily reconnaissance functions, others that appear to be involved in physical collection or processing activities, others that have clearly combat-oriented capabilities, others whose function is not obvious from direct observation. This diversity of function strongly suggests that whatever the Ark is doing on the surface, it is a complex multi-stage process involving different types of specialized activity. The machines are not all just soldiers defending a territory. They are workers in a larger enterprise, and the diversity of the workers is evidence for the complexity of the enterprise. The question of whether Ark machines are autonomous or directed is one of the most significant and least resolved questions in the lore. The behavior of individual machines suggests significant autonomy, the ability to make situational decisions without apparent external direction. But the behavior of groups of machines, the coordination that appears in how they respond to large-scale disturbances or threats, suggests some form of collective organization or communication that goes beyond individual machine decision-making. One possible reading of this is that the machines are autonomous at the individual level, but operate within a larger coordinated framework that shapes the parameters of their individual decision-making. What that larger framework is and where it comes from is one of the central mysteries of the Ark. The communication between Ark machines is something that has been extensively studied and imperfectly understood. Raiders who have observed groups of Ark machines in operation note that the machines appear to coordinate in ways that are not fully explained by simple proximity response or environmental triggers. There appears to be some form of information sharing occurring between machines that allows them to respond to each other's states and activities in ways that suggest mutual awareness. The medium and mechanism of this communication is not clearly established. It may be electromagnetic. It may involve something else. The question of how arc machines communicate with each other is directly relevant to the question of whether their communications can be disrupted or exploited by human actors. The apparent hierarchy or organization within the arc machine population is one of the most contested areas of raiding law. Observations from multiple sources suggest that not all arc machines are equal in terms of their operational authority, that certain machine types appear to coordinate or direct the activity of others in ways that suggest a hierarchical rather than purely peer-to-peer organization. The implications of this, if accurate, are significant. A hierarchical organization means there are potentially higher-level nodes of coordination that have more information and more authority than individual machines. Identifying those nodes and understanding their role in the overall arc operation is an obvious strategic priority, but the difficulty of doing so safely has limited the practical progress on this question. The arc machine's relationship to the resources of the surface world is one of the most directly observable aspects of their behavior. Whatever the larger purpose of the arc's operation on Earth, it clearly involves the manipulation and collection of specific material resources. The patterns of arc activity, what they're working on, and where, tell a story about what specific resources or materials they're most interested in. That story is incomplete and contested, but it is one of the clearest windows into the arc's larger purpose that the current state of knowledge provides. Understanding what the arc is collecting, and therefore what it is trying to accomplish, is one of the most important questions in the law. The arc machine's responses to human presence and human activity are highly context-dependent in ways that experienced raiders understand, but that can be difficult to communicate clearly to people who have not been on the surface. Arc machines do not simply attack humans on sight in all circumstances. Their responses range from apparent indifference to immediate lethal attention, depending on factors that include the specific machine type, the proximity, the activity the human is engaged in, and apparently the machine's current operational state. Understanding the conditions under which arc machines become actively hostile, as distinct from simply presenting a passive hazard, is one of the most practically important pieces of raiding knowledge, and it is knowledge that has cost many lives to accumulate. The question of whether arc machines are capable of learning from their interactions with humans is one of the more unsettling aspects of the law. If the machines simply execute fixed behavioral programs, then the accumulated raiding knowledge about how to manage arc encounters remains valid over time. If the machines are capable of adapting their behavior based on what they encounter, then that knowledge has a shelf life, and strategies that worked in the past may not work in the future. The evidence is ambiguous. There are observations that suggest arc machine behavior has evolved in ways that seem responsive to human tactics. There are other observations that suggest the behavioral patterns are more fixed than that. The uncertainty is itself important information, because it affects how reliably any specific body of raiding knowledge can be trusted. The physical capabilities of arc machines, the specific things they can do, and the specific limits of those capabilities are another area where raiding experience has generated a significant body of knowledge. Understanding what arc machines can and cannot do in terms of perception, movement, force application, and environmental interaction is directly relevant to survival on the surface. The details of these capabilities, the ways that they can be exploited and the ways they cannot, are part of the core practical knowledge that experienced raiders develop. But they also raise deeper questions about the design philosophy that produced these specific capability profiles, about what the builders of the arc machines were prioritizing and what trade-offs they were willing to accept. The damage and destruction of arc machines by human activity is possible and has been regularly accomplished by raiders, but it is not straightforward. Arc machines are durable and in many cases capable of some level of self-repair or damage adaptation. The knowledge of how to effectively destroy or disable different ARC machine types is among the most practically valuable raiding knowledge there is, and it is knowledge that has been developed through direct experience under life or death conditions. The specific vulnerabilities of different machine types, the approaches that work and the approaches that do not, are part of the core technical knowledge of the raiding community. The behavior of damaged ARC machines is particularly interesting from a law perspective because it sometimes reveals something about the machine's internal states and priorities. Machines that are significantly damaged sometimes behave in ways that differ from their undamaged normal patterns, in ways that suggest the prioritization of certain functions over others as capability decreases. These behavioral changes in damaged machines are a window into the machine's internal organization and priority structure that is not easily obtained in other ways. Raiders who pay attention to how damaged machines behave are generating some of the most interesting knowledge about ARC machine architecture available. The question of whether ARC machines experience anything analogous to pain, distress, or other subjective states is one that few in the tunnel civilization take seriously, but that the law seems to deliberately leave open. The behavioral evidence is ambiguous. Certain ARC machine responses to damage or threat do resemble responses that, in biological organisms, would be accompanied by aversive, subjective experience. But the similarity in behavior does not establish the similarity in inner experience, and the analogy between biological responses and machine responses may be superficial. The question is left open in the law, and it should be left open here as well. The size and scale diversity of ARC machines encountered on the surface is notable. The machine types range enormously in physical scale, from relatively small units to things whose dimensions are on the order of large vehicles or structures. This scale diversity suggests different functional specializations, because the physical requirements of different operational tasks in the ARC's overall mission would logically require different physical scales. The relationship between scale and function in ARC machine design is one of the more systematic areas of raiding-generated knowledge, though the larger scale machines, being both more dangerous and rarer, are also less thoroughly studied. The aesthetic dimensions of ARC machine design, the way they look beyond their functional requirements, is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the law. Human engineering tends to produce functional designs that, over time, also acquire aesthetic character, either through deliberate design choice or through the natural consequence of consistently applied functional principles. ARC machines have an aesthetic character that is specific and coherent, suggesting that their design was not purely functional, but reflected something about the values or culture of whoever made them. What that aesthetic character suggests about the ARC's origin is one of the more interpretively open questions in the law. The network or collective behavior of ARC machines, the way that groups of machines organize and coordinate their activities across large areas, is one of the most significant and least understood aspects of the ARC presence. Individual machine encounters are well documented by raiding experience. The large-scale organizational patterns that these individual machines are part of are much less well understood, because observing them requires perspectives that are difficult or dangerous to achieve. What raiding experience suggests about the collective organization of ARC machines, including the apparent existence of hub-like points of higher coordination, is among the most strategically important and most carefully guarded knowledge in the tunnel civilization. The ways in which ARC machines interact with the surface environment, beyond their interactions with humans, are a significant body of evidence about what the ARC is doing. The physical changes that ARC activity makes to the landscape, the structures they build, modify or demolish, the materials they accumulate or redistribute, all of these are legible signs of purpose. Reading them is difficult because the purpose is not immediately obvious from the observable behavior, but the behaviors are specific and consistent enough to support inferences about what they are oriented toward. Those inferences are some of the most important lore material in Arc Raiders, pointing toward a larger story about what the Ark is ultimately trying to accomplish. The question of where Ark machines come from in a supply and logistical sense is one that the current state of knowledge has not resolved. The machines operate continuously on the surface. They are destroyed by raiders with some regularity. The total number of machines does not appear to be decreasing. This implies either continuous production or that the raiding-induced attrition is small relative to the total machine population, or some combination of these. Whether the Ark is producing new machines on Earth from local resources, or deploying machines from a source outside Earth, or some combination, has enormous implications for understanding the scale and nature of the Ark enterprise. The environmental effects of Ark machine activity on the surface ecology are one of the more indirect but significant aspects of the Ark's impact. The machines are not simply destroying the surface environment, they are changing it in ways that appear to be directed rather than random. The specific environmental changes associated with Ark activity, changes in soil composition, in the distribution of certain materials, in the condition of the atmosphere in certain areas, all point toward a process that is purposeful rather than simply destructive. What the purpose of those environmental changes is remains unclear, but the consistency of the pattern strongly suggests that there is a purpose. The evolution of Ark machine capabilities over the history of the tunnel civilization is a body of evidence that is both important and difficult to interpret. Raiders who have been active for many years report changes in machine types and behaviors that suggest the Ark's operational presence on the surface is not static. New machine types have appeared. Old types have changed their behavioral parameters. The overall pattern of Ark activity has shifted in ways that suggest an ongoing process rather than the steady-state maintenance of a completed change. What that ongoing process is, what the Ark is working toward, is the question that all of this evidence is evidence for. The specific vulnerabilities and limitations of Ark machines are understandably among the most carefully guarded practical knowledge in the tunnel civilization. The communities that have developed effective methods for destroying or evading Ark machines do not necessarily share those methods freely, because that information has obvious strategic value. The politics of raiding knowledge, including the knowledge about how to deal with Ark machines effectively, is one of the places where the practical and the political are most directly entangled in the tunnel civilization. The fact that life-saving information is sometimes withheld for strategic or political reasons is one of the less comfortable aspects of the underground world. The relationship between Ark machine behavior and the specific locations where it occurs is one of the more practically useful patterns in raiding knowledge. Certain Ark machine types are more concentrated in certain locations. Certain behavioral modes are more common in certain environments. The patterns of Ark activity are not uniform across the surface, and the non-uniformity is evidence about what the Ark considers most important and most worth defending. Understanding the geography of Ark activity is therefore one of the keys to understanding the Ark's operational priorities, and that understanding in turn is one of the keys to understanding the Ark's larger purpose. The Ark machines encountered directly by raiders represent only a portion of the total Ark presence on the surface. There are areas of Ark activity that are so dense or so heavily defended that human exploration is, for practical purposes, impossible with current capabilities. What happens in those areas, what the most concentrated and defended Ark activities consist of, is one of the great unknown areas of the surface world. The indirect evidence about what occurs in these zones, gleaned from the behavior of machines at the periphery and from occasional observations by raiders who have pushed further than most, is some of the most significant and most contested lore material in the Ark Raiders world. The comparative analysis of different Ark machine types, the systematic description of their distinguishing characteristics, and the inferences that can be drawn from those characteristics about function and origin, is one of the more developed areas of tunnel civilization knowledge about the Ark. The people who specialize in this analysis, who have dedicated their working lives to understanding the Ark from the evidence available, have produced knowledge that is both practically valuable and theoretically significant. Their work is one of the places where the Ark Raiders' lore most directly engages with the question of what the Ark actually is. The philosophical and political implications of the Ark machine presence are one of the things that the lore raises in ways that are more suggestive than definitive. The Ark machines are evidence that something vastly more technologically capable than human civilization currently operates on the Earth. That fact has implications for how humans understand their own place in the universe, their own significance and agency, their own long-term prospects. Different factions in the tunnel civilization draw different conclusions from this fact, and those different conclusions drive different political agendas and different strategic priorities. The Ark machines are not just a physical threat, they are a fact about the universe that has to be integrated into any coherent worldview. The question of whether the Ark machines have goals, in the sense that implies something like intention or purpose, is one that different actors in the tunnel civilization answer differently. The engineers and scientists who study the machines tend toward a functionalist answer, that the machines have operational objectives programmed into them, without necessarily committing to any richer notion of intention. The more philosophically or spiritually oriented members of the tunnel communities sometimes attribute something more than functional programming to the machines, seeing in their behavior evidence of something that goes beyond mere mechanism. The law deliberately does not resolve this question, and that deliberate openness is one of the things that keeps it interesting. The specific patterns in Ark machine behavior that most strongly suggest some form of higher-level coordination are among the most significant and least publicly discussed pieces of lore in Ark Raiders. These patterns include what appear to be priority responses, where Ark machines in a large area shift their behavior in coordinated ways in response to events that no individual machine in the group could have directly observed. They include what appear to be resource allocation decisions, where the deployment of different machine types to different areas changes in ways that track the availability of specific resources or the execution of specific phases of the Ark's larger operation. And they include what appear to be strategic adaptations, where the overall pattern of Ark activity changes in ways that suggest a response to the cumulative effect of human raiding rather than any specific individual encounter. All of these patterns point toward a level of organization above the individual machine, and the nature of that higher organization is one of the deepest questions in the Ark Raiders' lore. The Ark machine's treatment of pre-Ark human infrastructure is one of the more interesting behavioral patterns in the record of Ark activity. The machines are not uniformly destructive to all pre-Ark structures. They have preferences and priorities that are reflected in what they damage, what they leave intact, and what they actively modify or incorporate into their operations. These preferences are specific enough to be evidence about what the Ark is looking for and what it considers functionally relevant to its own operations. Following the pattern of what the Ark has and has not destroyed is one of the more productive ways of developing inferences about what the Ark is ultimately trying to accomplish. The oldest surviving Ark machines, those that have been present on the surface since the early invasion period, carry a history in their wear and modification that is not present in newer or more recently deployed units. These older machines have been exposed to the changing conditions of the surface world across the entire history of the Ark presence, and their current state reflects that history. They are, in a sense, the physical archive of the Ark's activity over time, and studying them carefully is one of the ways that researchers have been able to trace the evolution of Ark activity. The challenge is getting close enough to study them without being destroyed. Chapter 6. The Factions. The factions of the Ark Raiders world are one of the most important and most politically charged aspects of the setting. They are the organized expressions of the different ways that the tunnel civilization has responded to its situation, the different visions of what survival means, what the priority should be, and what kind of future is worth working toward. Understanding the factions, their origins, their current positions, and their relationships to each other is essential for understanding the political landscape of the underground world and the competing interests that shape everything from raiding operations to community governance. The emergence of distinct factions in the tunnel civilization was not an inevitable development. In the early period of underground survival, the immediate demands of existence were unifying enough that fundamental disagreements about priorities and values were somewhat suppressed by necessity. As the community stabilized and the immediate crisis gave way to a more chronic condition, those suppressed disagreements began to find organized expression. The factions that exist in the current period of Ark Raiders lore are the result of this process of crystallization, where initially diffuse differences of opinion have, over time, organized themselves into something more structured and more politically consequential. The faction that most directly represents the interests of the established tunnel communities, the groups and institutions that have most successfully embedded themselves in the governance and resource management of the underground world, tends toward a conservative posture on questions about the Ark and the surface. This is not conservatism in a simple or single-dimensional sense. It is conservatism in the sense of favouring the stability of existing arrangements, of being cautious about actions that could disrupt the balance that the tunnel communities have achieved, of prioritising the maintenance of what works over the pursuit of change that is inherently risky. This faction's relationship to raiding is instrumental. Raiding is important because it provides resources, but raiding should be managed and controlled, not allowed to generate unexpected complications that could destabilize the underground communities. The faction most oriented toward actively challenging the Ark's control of the surface is the one whose agenda most directly aligns with what the game's raiding activity points toward. These are the people who believe that the tunnel civilization's long-term survival requires changing the fundamental situation, that simply maintaining underground existence indefinitely is not a viable strategy, and that the only path forward involves understanding the Ark well enough to somehow counter or circumvent its operations on the surface. This faction values raiding not just instrumentally, but as a strategic activity, as the primary mechanism through which the knowledge and capability needed for active engagement with the Ark can be developed. It is willing to accept higher risks in pursuit of this agenda. The tension between these two broad orientations, maintenance versus challenge, is the central political tension in the tunnel civilization. But it is not the only tension. There are other factions defined by other axes of disagreement. There are groups whose primary agenda is the retrieval and preservation of specific pre-Ark knowledge, who believe that the key to addressing the Ark situation lies in something that was known or developed before the invasion, and that has been lost or suppressed. There are groups whose primary commitment is to the specific community they come from, rather than to any broader tunnel civilization agenda. There are groups whose orientation to the Ark is fundamentally different from either the maintenance or the challenge factions, who see the Ark as something other than simply an enemy to be endured or overcome. The faction with perhaps the most unusual and most theoretically interesting orientation to the Ark is the one that has begun to develop a reading of the machines as something other than simply an alien threat. This faction, drawing on accumulated evidence about Ark machine behavior and purpose, has begun to develop a framework in which the Ark is understood as operating according to a logic that could, potentially, be engaged with rather than simply resisted. This is not capitulation or collaboration in any simple sense. It is a more complex position, based on the reading that the Ark has a specific purpose that may not be inherently incompatible with human survival, and that understanding that purpose precisely enough might reveal ways of negotiating around rather than through the conflict. This faction is small and politically controversial, but it is not without evidence for its position. The role of specific individuals, charismatic leaders, visionary thinkers, or skilled organizers in shaping the factions is significant in the Ark Raiders lore. Factions are not purely structural phenomena. They are also the expressions of specific people's ideas and personal histories. The founders and current leaders of the major factions are characters whose personal histories, experiences, and commitments are embedded in the political positions they advocate. Understanding these individuals, and particularly understanding the specific experiences that shape their positions on the Ark and the Tunnel civilization's response to it, is one of the more engaging forms of lore exploration in the game. The economic dimensions of faction differences are often more significant than the ideological dimensions, even when the public discourse of faction politics emphasizes ideology. Different factions benefit from different aspects of the current arrangement of the Tunnel civilization and face different costs from changes to that arrangement. The faction that manages the most resource-rich tunnel communities has interests that are not neutral in relation to policy questions about raiding or Ark engagement. The faction that has invested most heavily in the development of anti-Ark capabilities has interests that are served by a political environment that supports continued investment in those capabilities. Following the economic interests embedded in faction politics is one of the most reliable ways of understanding what is actually at stake in any given political dispute. The relationships between factions and specific raiding communities are one of the most practically significant aspects of the faction landscape. Different factions support, direct, and benefit from raiding operations in different ways, and the alignment between specific raiding communities and specific factions shapes the missions those raiders undertake, the objectives they pursue, and the knowledge they prioritize bringing back. A raiding operation is never politically neutral because it is always conducted within an organizational and resource context that is shaped by faction interests. Understanding the faction context of any specific raiding operation is important for understanding why it is being done and who benefits from what is brought back. The history of faction conflict in the Tunnel civilization is a story of periodic escalation and de-escalation, of moments when the political tensions between factions have turned into something more directly violent, and moments when those tensions have been managed through negotiation and compromise. The historical record of these cycles is important for understanding the current political moment, for understanding what previous attempts at resolution looked like, what worked and what did not, and what the current situation has in common with and differs from previous cycles. The factions have been through variations of their current conflicts before, and the outcomes of those previous rounds have shaped the current landscape. The information environment in the Tunnel civilization is itself one of the most significant areas of faction competition. Different factions have different interests in what is known, what is believed, and what is officially recognized as true. The control of information, including information about the Ark and information about the history of the Tunnel civilization, is a form of power that the factions compete for actively. The official knowledge that circulates in the Tunnel communities is not a neutral scientific or historical record. It is the product of a process of selection and interpretation that reflects faction interests as much as the objective evidence. Understanding what is known and who has an interest in it being known that way is one of the more sophisticated forms of engagement with Ark Raiders lore. The younger generation of Tunnel-born community members is a significant political resource that the factions are actively competing for. Young people who have grown up entirely underground have a different relationship to the pre-Ark world, to the history of the invasion, and to the current situation than any previous generation. They also have a different relationship to the established factions, less bound by the specific historical loyalties and grievances that shape the allegiances of their parents. The factions are aware that the political future of the tunnel civilization is being determined in large part by what the current younger generation thinks and what they are willing to commit to. The education and socialization of young people is therefore one of the most contested political battlegrounds in the tunnel civilization. The relationship between factions and the specific arc machine phenomena that are most politically significant is one of the more interesting aspects of the lore. Different factions interpret the same arc behaviors and discoveries differently, in ways that reflect their prior commitments and serve their political interests. A discovery that points toward the arc having a specific kind of purpose might be interpreted by one faction as evidence that engagement is possible, and by another as evidence that the threat is even more serious than previously understood. The politicization of arc-related knowledge is both understandable and dangerous, because it means that the knowledge most relevant to the tunnel civilization's survival is being filtered through political frameworks before it influences decision-making. The question of what a faction victory would actually look like, what would change in the tunnel civilization if any given faction's agenda were to prevail, is one of the most important questions to ask about the faction landscape. Some faction victories would result in significant changes to how the tunnel civilization operates and relates to the surface. Others might result in changes that are more symbolic than substantive. The ability to think clearly about what the actual stakes of faction competition are, beyond the rhetoric of faction politics, is one of the more valuable analytical capabilities for understanding the Ark Raiders world. The external pressure of the Ark itself is one of the factors that both unifies and divides the factions. The shared threat creates some degree of common cause, some recognition that the differences between tunnel communities are secondary to the shared challenge they face. But the same threat also intensifies the political competition, because the stakes of getting the response wrong are so high. The factions disagree not just about tactics, but about fundamental questions regarding what the Ark is, what it wants, and whether the current approach to managing it is sustainable. These disagreements become more rather than less intense as the perception of urgency increases. The role of memory and historical narrative in faction identity is significant. Every major faction in the tunnel civilization has a specific narrative about the history of the underground world that supports its current political position. These narratives emphasize different events, different actors, different outcomes. They are not simply propaganda in a cynical sense, though they certainly serve political functions. They are also genuine expressions of how the members of each faction understand the world they live in, shaped by the experiences and interpretations that their specific community history has produced. The conflict between these historical narratives is one of the most basic forms of faction competition. The possibility and difficulty of inter-faction cooperation is one of the recurring themes in Ark Raiders lore. The factions are aware at some level that the challenges facing the tunnel civilization are larger than any single faction can address. The cases where different factions have managed to cooperate, to set aside their competition in service of a shared objective, are some of the most interesting political episodes in the underground world's history. Those cases of cooperation are also typically fragile, because the underlying differences that drive faction competition do not go away just because a specific shared objective has been identified. The politics of building and maintaining interfaction cooperation is one of the more practically significant aspects of the tunnel civilization's political life. The faction landscape is not static. New factions have formed. Old ones have split or merged or declined. The current configuration of the political landscape reflects a specific historical moment, and understanding the dynamics that are pushing it toward change is important for understanding where the Ark Raiders world is going. The pressures for change include the evolution of the Ark's presence on the surface, the generational change in the tunnel population, the consequences of specific raiding discoveries and political decisions, and the cumulative effects of the resource and biological pressures on the underground communities. All of these are driving the political landscape toward a configuration that does not yet exist, and the direction of that change is one of the most important questions in the current Ark Raiders lore. The specific grievances and aspirations that motivate faction members at the individual level are as important as the structural analysis of faction interests. People join and commit to factions for reasons that are personal as well as political. The specific experiences that lead people to one faction rather than another, the particular injustices or insights or commitments that drive individual political engagement are part of the lore that gives the faction landscape its human texture. The political is always personal in the Ark Raiders world, and the personal is always political. The role of secrecy and hidden information in faction politics is one of the more practically significant aspects of the political landscape. Every major faction maintains information that it does not share openly, intelligence about the Ark, about other factions, about specific resources and capabilities that it manages carefully as a political asset. The existence of this withheld information means that the publicly available picture of any faction's knowledge and capabilities is systematically incomplete. Raiders who operate within faction contexts are often aware of being given partial pictures, and learning to read what is withheld as well as what is shared is one of the more important skills for navigating the political dimensions of raiding. The physical territories associated with different factions are one of the more visible aspects of the faction landscape. Different factions have stronger or weaker presences in different tunnel communities, and the geography of faction strength is not random